Martin could smell the burnt coffee before he even reached the double-glass doors. It was a Copenhagen morning. Gray, wet, streetlight amber still winning against the sun. That time between third and fourth period, when the air of St. Paul's High School became a low-grade riot of body odor, French fry grease, and the dew on 10,000 unbrushed teenage molars. He walked across the slick tarmac of the quad, windbreaker half-zipped, and Stefan was already perched on the concrete bench, boots up on the seat, eyes squinting at his phone. Stefan said, "You're late," without looking up. "I stopped for a croissant." Martin yanked his own phone from his back pocket. Unread memes, low battery. He grinned, forced. And also, time is a construct. "Yeah, tell that to Jensen." Stefan sent a look sideways over the rim of the phone. His hair was a mess. "It would have taken even longer if I'd gotten that croissant from Paris." Martin snorted. Martin wanted a meteor strike, or at the very least, a catastrophic plumbing disaster. Anything to make the school day tolerable. Instead, they were sitting in the schoolyard, and then there was that persistent hum of Copenhagen suburbs in spring, the air thick with pollen and expectation. "Paris? Did you actually see the train ticket prices?" Stefan said, spinning an empty water bottle with flicks of his middle finger. "Come on," Martin said. "That's exactly why I'd hitchhike down there." The idea landed between them with the force and clarity of breaking glass. At first, even Martin doubted his own words. Hitchhike to Paris? But the syllables were out, already ricocheting through Stefan's startled face, the phrase instantly both stupid and inevitable. Rain misted the cracked blacktop of the schoolyard, pinging off Martin's windbreaker, turning breath into steam. Stefan grinned behind his hand, and for a heartbeat, Martin saw the proposal's glimmer reflected in his friend's teeth. Paris. Why not? "Please," Martin said. "You said you wanted legendary." Stefan rolled his eyes, but he didn't look away. "I said a trip, not an obituary." "Stop being so Danish about it. Where's your Viking spirit?" Stefan huffed, but his ears were red. "My Viking spirit likes trains." "Your Viking spirit is a pensioner," Martin said. "It's so senile that it forgets the fact that you can't afford trains." An idea was born. The first Thursday of Easter break arrived the way a migraine did. Sun too bright, raw nerves, Martin's bag packed since 7 a.m. and killing his shoulders on the suburban metro train, every stop down the commuter line. Stefan met him at the Høje Taastrup station under the bleak sky, hands thrust deep in jacket pockets, hood up like a monk's cowl. "You sure you want to do this?" Stefan asked, as if seeing Martin's bag, the neon rain cover stretched over it like a bad swimsuit, made it all real. "Already told my mom I'll be in Paris by Saturday," Martin said, voice carefully reckless. "If I come back with less than 3 new languages and tetanus, she'll be disappointed." They cut between industrial warehouses and some half-hearted marshland, Martin leading, Stefan's steps silent behind him. The road to the truck stop veered off the highway, under a ring of power lines that gave everything a staticky feeling. The truck stop looked like every other one on the internet. Lines of lorries shoulder to shoulder, all idling, all monstrous, exhaling vapor into the morning. The parking lot was half liquid, pockmarked with puddles from a recent rain, which reflected a sky the color of instant oats. 30 meters away, a prefab building sagged under the weight of its own fluorescent lights. The label, Grill and Pit, letters fried by weather, cigarette smoke trickling out the automatic doors. Inside, Danes in navy jumpsuits sipped coffee. Stefan hovered by the vending machine, watching Martin negotiate with the snacks, pretending he didn't care, but clearly casing the prices. Martin's hands shook as he fed coins. On the third try, the machine spat the bills out, and he kicked at the scuffed metal base. The sound made every head in the pit swivel. Martin felt them all, a cold stripe up his spine all the way to his hands. He tried to smile at the others, but their faces were already back to their mugs, features shuttered. Workers on break, unified in their disinterest. They hunkered on a table by the window, flipping through Martin's notebook. He'd drawn up a list. Germany, Luxembourg, Belgium, France. Big circles around the cities. "The trick is not to look like you're doing the Interrail," Martin whispered, "or they just assume you're a leech." Stefan tapped at his phone. "This says no hitchhiking allowed on the Autobahn. That's why we sneak on at the rest areas. You always believe the rules." Stefan snorted. "Yeah, like they'll post cops on every dumpster out here." For an hour, they shuffled between the cafes, parking lot, and the breezeway to the toilets, looking for drivers who didn't resemble serial killers. After a while, they played a game. Spot the owner of each truck before he reached it. Martin picked beige Volvo, Gollum vibes, and watched a gaunt man in an Adidas tracksuit flick a cigarette toward the ground, then slide behind the wheel, not once glancing back. Stefan clocked Pepsi Max delivery, probable gambling debt, and they both laughed too loud when the driver came out clutching 5 lottery scratchers, his blue cap pulled low. All the while, Martin's spine vibrated with the awkwardness of waiting. The social torture of standing near a man while evaluating if his face meant friendly or axe murderer. The desperate, calculated hope of eye contact. After every near miss, the urge to flee built a little more. "You know," Stefan said, "if I didn't already hate men's rooms, I'd hate them now." "Imagine living here," Martin said. "Your life is piss and beef jerky and overpriced condensation." "So, like Sweden." Stefan angled his head at a Volvo with a rainbow sticker on the back window, the only pop of color in the bleak lot. Martin knocked his foot against the bench leg. "We need an offensive. I read a thing. If you stand by an exit ramp with a sign, it doubles your chances." Stefan raised his eyebrows. "That's because the police can see you. Instant expulsion, no trial." He keyed open his backpack and unzipped the front pouch. "Fine," he said, fishing out the notebook. "Give me a pen." After 3 wasted sheets. "That spelling isn't even German. No one can read that handwriting. It looks like you're selling kidneys." They settled on a simple South in jagged uppercase letters. Stefan tore the page out, folded it, then grinned and tried to hand it to Martin. "No way," Martin said. "You're the one with deranged handwriting," he protested, but Stefan only flashed his braces and kept the sign clutched in his fist. They posted up near the ramp's mouth, beside a garish yellow litter bin. Trucks peeled past, halogen eyes blank, each gust flattening their sign to their shins. The wind had knives in it. After 10 minutes, Martin was ready to call it and go back inside for another vending machine pastry. 10 minutes after that, his feet throbbed so hard he stomped them just for the pain. Half an hour in, Stefan started doing this dance whenever headlights approached. Hold the sign high with jazz hands, put on a pleading orphan face. It wasn't, objectively, more humiliating than the rest of it. But the 4th or 5th time, a silver Skoda slowed. The passenger window wound down, and a guy in a high-vis vest and rectangular sunglasses leaned out and said, "You boys lost?" "Not lost," Martin said, but it came out weird, voice stalling mid-gear. Next to him, Stefan blinked, then rattled the sign like it might become legible through sheer force. The man, maybe 30, shaved head, beard speckled with lunch, looked them over for a moment. The radio in his dash spat out Danish pop. "Where you going?" "South," Stefan said, and then more hopeful, "Germany?" The guy hooked a thumb back at his passenger seat, which was a chaos of Red Bull cans and a paper sandwich wrapper. "Border run," he said. "You buy the sausage and booze, right? Then back before the wife notices." He laughed. "Come, I can take you to Padborg." Martin hesitated, breathing sharp, and waited for Stefan to say no. But Stefan was already rounding the hood, and then Martin was climbing into the passenger seat, the cold vinyl against his thighs. The car purged with the smell of cigarettes and floor mat dust. The driver's name was Jonas, and he'd made the South run 100 times, sometimes for work, sometimes just to buy cheap groceries. "Beer is 10 crowns a can over the border," he said, voice thick, glancing at Martin in the cracked rear view. Martin nodded like he understood. The world scorched by the car's heater, the windows starting to bead with sweat and breath. Already, the truck stop was a memory. A bad movie you watched once on a school night. Jonas wanted to know what Martin and Stefan were doing. Martin tried to sound chill about it, said they had friends in France, that they were taking the scenic route. He left out the part about not having any real plan. Stefan, in the back seat, made up a cousin in Strasbourg who'd promised to show them the city if they could get there before Easter. Jonas laughed, shoving the car into the hard right lane, the whole chassis groaning like it was angry to be awake. "French women, eh? Better than Denmark, trust me," he said, then nearly clipped a delivery truck as he swerved to merge. Martin flinched and tried not to look at the speedometer or the horizon eating itself in the morning rain. Jonas kept the volume high on the pop station, chain-smoking and asking if either of them had ever lived, like real men, out of a backpack. Martin said something about summer festival camping and was met with a snort so loud it fogged the windshield. They passed the city limits. The buildings broke into factories and logistics centers, then into big blank stretches of wind turbines and sodden fields that looked like wet corduroy. For a while, Jonas sang along with the radio, Sepultura and Aqua, in the same 10 minutes, which was maybe illegal. Stefan watched the scenery, eyes darting from window to window as if he expected to catch something important in the blur. Martin just saw highways, hard gray and endless. No one spoke for a good while. The trip would take about 4 hours. Padborg was a nothing sort of town, all warehousing and wind, the last Danish outpost before Germany started. They arrived in town during the early afternoon. Jonas let them out by a service station where the trucks bottlenecked toward the border. "Good luck," he said, and Martin managed a thank you as Jonas peeled away, loud in his freedom. Stefan's teeth chattered as he shouldered his pack. "Stage 1 complete," he said, like it was a mission. "Now what?" "Now we repeat," Martin answered, even as he scanned the lot and realized there were maybe 10 possible rides. For all the internet message boards promising pan-European brotherhood of the road, it felt less like a world of solidarity and more like getting stranded in a lunar colony. Identical boxy buildings, hum of compressors, a few men in high-vis vests hunched over cigarettes and the glow of cigarette tips. The sky was flattening out, a sheet metal dome hung with slow-moving clouds. In every direction, tarmac, razor wire fencing, lorry trailers stacked like cargo container Legos. Martin steered them inside the attached fast food place, already regretting not keeping one of Jonas's Red Bulls. The usual selection of beige men in work clothes filled the booths or clustered at the counter. Martin hit the urinal, washed his hands for too long, then stared at his own face in the mirror, trying to look like someone capable of getting to France. He practiced a smirk that didn't stick. He imagined his parents seeing him now, alone, hours from home, no plan worth the paper it was written on. The idea made his stomach hollow out. He found Stefan by the self-order kiosk, punching at the greasy screen. "Everything here is animal or fried," Stefan said. "Or both." Martin shrugged. He ordered 2 cheeseburgers. They ate at a table, sticky with dried cola rings, Stefan pulling apart his burger slice by slice, Martin just inhaling his, not tasting a thing. Every few minutes, a new trucker would shuffle in, pay for a hot dog, maybe look their way, never for long. Martin saw the whole afternoon leaking away in thin, tan increments. "Next one to chicken out has to swallow one of those pickled eggs," Stefan said, voice low. Martin grunted. "Not even a real punishment. I bet they taste fine." Stefan pointed at a jar on the counter, eggs floating in amber like preserved tumors. Prove it. Martin stuck out his tongue and made a big show of wincing, but there wasn't room in his head for games. That creeping nausea from the bathroom mirror was back, pressing at his ribs. He felt slow, a delay between thought and movement, like the world was buffering. He started scanning the far tables, looking for signals. Jackets, logos, the shape of a man's hands. He was losing sensation in his knees. Every passing truck outside felt like a missed shot. Stefan nudged his shin under the table. That guy? The Polish plates? Martin scanned the parking lot. Just a lorry cab, square and battered, with a red crowned eagle decal and a rosary hanging from the rear view. You speak Polish? He asked. Worse than Jensen's English, Stefan said, and wiped his palm on his thigh. Anyway, you're up. The driver was older, wiry, in a slouchy windbreaker. He had dark eyes set too deep in the sockets and the kind of mustache that suggested an immune system weaponized by decades of smoke and brine. At Martin's approach, the man braced himself as if for a robbery. Excuse me, Martin started. He pointed to himself, then to Stefan still at the table, visible through the glass. He made a steering gesture, then pointed at the truck, then at the highway. Deutschland? The driver looked past him to Stefan, one eyebrow flicking up. Martin felt the 5 seconds stretch out to a solid minute. The man's fingers kept moving, rolling and unrolling a blue ballpoint pen, hands inked with something that could have been a number or a word. Finally, you want ride? A voice like sandpaper. The accent was thick, but the English was tighter than Martin expected. Yes, only Germany, Martin said, and nodded, like that was a thing you did. Frankfurt, or... He snapped his fingers, trying to remember the next city on the route. Stuttgart? The driver shrugged, then looked at the watch on his wrist, and then at Martin's bag. Only to Hamburg. I sleep Hamburg. Tomorrow I go more. Martin glanced at Stefan over his shoulder. Stefan gave a thumbs up, then pointed at his own chest and made a call me gesture. Martin's own sweat cooled against his lower back. He forced a smile. Hamburg is great. Hamburg is perfect. The driver grunted and pointed at Martin's bag, then jerked his head toward the lot. Now, he said. 5 minutes later, there was a wordless transaction of bags into the cab's back seat. Martin's and then Stefan's, then Stefan himself, pausing at the running board to mop at his nose and give the man another angled nod. The inside of the cab was oceanic with air freshener and something meaty like fried liver. Flags of Poland and Hungary dangled from the dash. A cardboard pine tree spun drunkenly on a broken AC vent. The highway came alive immediately, lanes slick, water sheeting the glass. The trucker muttered angrily at other drivers whenever he merged, each expletive and teeth click half a language in itself. Names, proverbs, curses. Martin tried to code them out, but could only guess at the driver's inner monologue. In the seat, Stefan had gone wordless too, hands curled into his lap, watching the white lines rip backward under the tires. When the radio came on, it was the kind of slushy dance pop you could only get on European commercial bands, synths phased through static. The man, Mr. Driver, as Martin defaulted to thinking of him, fiddled with the dial until a news brief came up. It was too fast for Martin's years of schoolroom German. A chunk of it sounded like border delays and a word that might have been Stau. Martin decided this was fine. If a cop or border guard was about to ruin their day, it would happen soon enough. For the first 40 minutes, no one spoke. Mr. Driver kept his hands on the wheel even when the truck stuck at the queue, which was often. Martin counted the ticks of the blinker. Double tap, pause, double tap. He could see the thick, fraying hairs on the knuckles. They were like moss on a rock, indifferent to the seasons. The hours smeared past. Even in a truck, the trip was domination by monotony. Trucks leaned on trucks for company, all of them boxed in by flat expanses of mud, the odd windmill, an occasional deer feeding close to the highway shoulder. Stefan's pale reflection drifted in the window, sometimes flickering in and out with the motion of passing cars. Martin tried to make up absurd backstories for each license plate, scribbling in his notebook until his hand cramped. Stefan dozed with his mouth half open, head against the window. Sometimes a snore would erupt, and the driver would spit a sharp word in Polish, sometimes with a sideways grin. The world outside flashed by, and sometimes rain lashed the windshield so hard it sounded like applause. The truck pulled off the highway for fuel and a piss break. Stefan surfaced from his nap, blinking hard, his hair dented from the window. The driver said, 15-minute, and stalked to the building, limping slightly. Martin and Stefan stood by the cab, silent, facing the heavy gray of early evening. Germany doesn't look that different, Stefan said. It's got way more wind turbines, Martin said. He counted 3 on the horizon, their arms spinning like they were keeping time with some gigantic clock. Stefan cracked his back. I thought it'd feel more, I don't know, warmer, breadier? Martin snorted. You need sleep. He pawed at his phone, saw 2 bars of signal, enough to text his mom a quick, hungry but alive, still on plan. Then the driver was back, a pack of smokes jammed in his breast pocket, a paper sack hanging from one hand. He cranked the window and offered them each a wedge of greasy pastry from the bag. Stefan took his, bit in, and made a face like he'd been slapped. Fish? He whispered, but ate the rest. Martin ate his slower, tongue itching from the salt and oil. Herrings? Mr. Driver said, catching Martin's glance. Very good for growing boys. Martin angled a look toward Stefan. We're basically adult men, he said, but the next pastry lumped in his throat and he let the subject die. Warm air in the cabin, rain still gnawing at the windows. Time dissolved. After a while, the radio lost its signal and the cab glowed with an unfamiliar hush. The road blurred to just the slap of tires, white lane lines, the hum of voltage from hidden guts of the truck and the breakbeat thump of Martin's own heart, even though he wasn't afraid, not really. More like alert, alive. The city fizzed up out of the nothingness with a suddenness that made Martin blink. Hamburg's northern sprawl, a confusion of chain hotels, DIY stores, and billboards pitching next-day groceries. Flat and ugly and somehow more Scandinavian than Denmark. The truck swung off at a roundabout, dicing through construction barriers, then huddled on the edge of a silent logistics park. The trucker killed the engine with a groan and pointed at the digital clock, 19:03, but the sky looked like it was already deep into tomorrow, and said, Sleep here. 6 morning, more south. You come if sleep truck. If not, you go now. Stefan shrugged. We find hostile, or... Martin hadn't gamed this out. He blinked at the driver, who shrugged back, businesslike but not unkind. We can manage, he said, but the cab's heat tempted him. Outside, the wet air slapped him feral, smelling of gasoline and the far-off shock of ozone. He zipped his jacket to his chin and pretended he wasn't shivering. The driver grunted and unfolded the passenger bench, revealing a nest of blankets and a plastic-wrapped pillow that looked like it came free with a mattress. Martin tried to imagine sleeping with the windows fogged, in a capsule of someone else's life. He pictured his friends at home, gaming, sitting in their basements, faces glowing with screens, none of them here, none of them doing this. He watched Stefan hustle towards the lot's edge, boots sloshing in pooled runoff. Should we? Stefan said, voice muffled by a scarf. Martin nodded. They headed towards the truck stop at the other end of the logistics park. Everything in the Rasthof was radioactive with color, like the entire building had been dipped in safety orange and bomb-popped blue. Martin blinked, saw his own reflection looking back at him from 6 different flat screens. The football game, a news ticker, a Lufthansa ad, 1 CCTV monitor for each cash register. Half the faces in the place were drivers. The other half were ghosts, doomed to spend eternity at this exact latitude, spooning sausage into their mouths and blinking at cell phone screens. Stefan dipped his head the second they got inside, tried to look invisible but wasn't. He gravitated to the first empty booth and shrank into his parka. Outside, the rain got meaner and came at the window sideways, beating and streaming and making every parked lorry look like it was melting. Martin pulled up the hood on his windbreaker and scanned the counter. The food was all under lucite domes, pretzels as big as steering wheels, fruit pies quivering on racks, a slumping tray of schnitzels. Even the healthy options were plastic salads, triangles of pale pink ham and lettuce floating in a tub of brine. He pointed at a bratwurst, then pantomimed coffee, then paid with a 50 and got a shower of coins he didn't count. He brought the tray to Stefan's booth. Stefan was picking at a wet corner of his backpack, like if he worried hard enough it might dry out. Martin set the food down and chiseled at the sausage casing with a plastic knife. "You notice how everyone stares at us," Stefan said without looking up. "They're jealous of my coat," Martin said. The joke was weak, but Stefan snorted and let out some tension. Martin poured the little packet of mustard into his mouth, then pointed a fork at the door. "Should we try for a lift tonight or wait for the Polish guy?" "I'm not sure we should trust the Polish guy," Stefan said. His voice was tighter than before, not joking. He had a way of sounding like a 12-year-old when he was anxious, which Martin would normally roast him for, but not tonight. "Fine, we beg for a ride now," Martin said, then immediately get stabbed for our organs and wake up in a bathtub outside Ulm. The bratwurst was grayish in the middle. He ate it anyway, pretending it was a prop for his own crime documentary. "What's the other plan?" Stefan slumped, then cracked his knuckles one by one. "I don't know. Find a hostel? It's Germany. They probably have rules about sleeping behind vending machines." A thunder gust banged the glass. Martin watched fat beads stream into each other and imagined them as race cars, picking a winner to reach the bottom. He scraped the last of the mustard from the cup. "I'm not paying 15 euros for beds that look like a coffin." He flashed Stefan a look he hoped was rallying, but doubt pressed at the back of his teeth. For a while, they nursed the coffee, watching the wet geometry of headlights sweep across the walls each time a new truck arrived. The entry door was one of those magical kinds that you could never open on the first try, which meant every arrival announced itself with a clatter and a flurry of swearing in some language Martin barely recognized. It was almost comforting. A lull settled onto the Rasthof. Most of the other tables were now colonized by solitary men. A few of them read newspapers folded perfectly into squares. One guy next to the napkin stand was eating a plate of scrambled eggs with a patience usually reserved for chess. Martin tried to imagine any of them offering a lift to two drenched high schoolers squatting in a fluorescent graveyard at midnight. Definitely possible. Probably not worth waiting for. He got up and threw away the food wrappers, then hesitated at the drink machine. Now or never. He circled back to Stefan, who was poking holes in the sugar packets with one of the tiny wooden stir sticks. "I'm going to see if anyone's headed south," Martin said. "You coming?" Stefan didn't answer right away. He looked so small like that, hunched into himself, damp and bony. Martin could see the ribcage moving under his t-shirt. At home, that would have been something to mock. Here, it was ballast. Martin waited. Finally, Stefan shrugged and said, "Don't get trafficked." So quietly only the empty booth heard. Martin left him there. He did a counterclockwise walk of the Rasthof, trying not to look like a beggar or a drug addict or a runaway. Just someone extremely invested in vending machines. It was all men, some with tattooed knuckles, some with receding hairlines and bloodshot eyes, one with a Santa beard flecked in tobacco. Martin hovered by the coffee urn, waiting for someone to look up. One guy did. A younger face, square-jawed, dark hair and little wet clumps from the rain. His eyes flicked from Martin's face to the big, stupid rain cover on the backpack. "Sprichst du English?" Martin asked, voice up-pitched and apologetic. The man just stared, then shrugged and said, "Little?" in a voice like a shoe scraping mud. Martin glanced at the trucker's jacket. Some kind of company patch. He tried to conjure the advice from the internet. Be direct, be friendly, be a little pathetic, but not too much. We need ride south. Maybe Dortmund? Frankfurt is also good. The man chewed his lip for a beat. Martin braced for a no, a laugh, a punchline. But the guy just nodded. The motion was slow and mechanical, then sipped his coffee, never breaking eye contact. Frankfurt, yes, I go. I can take you and... The man made a vague gesture, something between your shadow and the one you left at the table. Awesome, thank you, Martin said. He fumbled his phone from his pocket. When do you leave? The trucker pursed his lips, looked at the wall clock, then at Martin's sodden jacket. 20 minutes, smoke, eat, then drive. He gestured with one splay-fingered hand at the entry vestibule. Truck is white. Man, number... He rattled off a string of digits like it made any difference. Martin nodded and grinned and said, "Danke, danke," twice too loud, then scooted away, heat rising into his face. It was always like this. The split second of courage, then the slow leak of all your resolve. Every time. He left the trucker at the coffee urn and circled back to Stefan with a surfeit of nervous energy. He found Stefan at the window, watching the night heave water against the glass. "We got something," Martin said, and felt the words come out too loud, as if volume alone could conjure confidence. "Guy leaves in 20. Is it the one with the neck tattoo?" Stefan asked, not turning from the storm, but his posture eased, the news as good as calories. "Other side, blue jacket." Martin could remember every twitch of the man's jaw, the deliberate way he'd spoken. "Looks like he could kill a horse, but normal, I think." He wondered if Stefan could tell he was lying, that he had no fucking clue what qualified as normal anymore. "Fine," Stefan said, standing, all rubber limbs and tired eyes. The lumpy parka made him look like a hermit crab. "Let's just get it over with." There was zero mirth in his voice, but the clarity of that surrender jolted Martin back into the moment. They bussed their table, zipped the packs, waded back out onto the soaked plaza. The wind hit Martin's face with a snap, so cold it made his teeth ache. He wrapped his arms around his chest and felt, for the 1,000th time, the emptiness of his own bravado. They waited under the acrylic awning, which did nothing for the sideways rain. Stefan's sneakers were already ruined, squelching with each step. Martin pretended his feet weren't just as bad. He watched the trucks idling in the lot, each one broadcasting its make loudly in block capitals. Scania, Volvo, MAN. Blue Jacket's white rig was easy to spot, hunched at the edge of the line with its hazard lights tick-tocking in the wet black. The trucker was already at the edge of the lot, half sheltered under the shadow of his rig, tapping a cigarette against his phone while scrolling. He didn't look up until Martin and Stefan were almost on top of him. Martin recognized the face. Rough cut, pockmarks softened by stubble, eyes like river stones. The blue jacket was zipped to the chin, the collar cinched so tight it bit into the man's neck. For a microsecond, Martin wondered if the guy had ever strangled someone with those hands. He offered a quick, "Hi," his own voice sounding like a squeak, and the driver just nodded, flicked his barely smoked butt into the puddle and said, "We go now?" "Yeah," Martin said, and Stefan, behind him, made a noise that might have been agreement. There was a clatter of keys. The man opened the cab passenger door with his foot, like he didn't want to touch anything he didn't have to, and stepped aside to let them in. Martin climbed the narrow metal stairs, trying not to slip on the wet, ridged step. The cab was a single box of air so stale it almost tasted like the inside of a walk-in freezer. Plastic, cleaning solvent, a background note of sweat. The floor mats were layered in wet paper towels. A half-deflated dashboard bobblehead of a woman in a dirndl wobbled with every movement. Martin wedged himself into the shotgun seat. Stefan took the bunk behind, unrolling and re-rolling his hood. The driver introduced himself as Karl Heinz. He did not explain if that was one name or two. His English was blunt and clipped, sentences amputated to the cleanest possible shapes. "Sleep not so good tonight," he said. "We go safety stop by Castle." He glanced sidelong at Martin, eyebrow barely ticking upward for a response. "Sounds good," Martin said, too fast, and realized Karl Heinz's gaze lingered on Martin for a moment, maybe waiting for a clue whether this kid would make trouble or just keep his mouth shut. The engine shuddered awake, jumpy, a sound that made Martin's bones vibrate. Stefan's face, reflected in the side window, was a thin smudge, his mouth set in a straight line. There was no way to tell what went on in his head anymore. Not when he could go silent for hours, then snap back with a single word. They rolled out. The rain worked at the glass like the world was filling up with water, a gradual drowning. As the headlights carved the Autohof exit, Karl Heinz reached for a half-crumpled pouch of tobacco and started rolling a cigarette one-handed, somehow steering with the other. Martin counted 4 rings on the man's fingers, all battered and uneven, like he'd found them at separate flea markets. The man didn't offer conversation, just hummed a deep bassline melody under his breath. The gears rumbled up through the range and they slalomed onto the Autobahn, where the world became a tunnel of white stripes and taillights in the rain. For a long time, no one talked. Martin pressed his forehead to the cold window and let the trance of highway whine and wipers swoosh numb his brain. The drizzle was relentless. Martin counted seconds between the wipers, made a sport of timing their every pass. Outside, there was only darkness except when the rare oncoming truck blasted retinas with a headlight strobe, then swept past like a missile. Stefan had curled on his side, face to the cab wall, hoodie pulled up like he wanted to disappear into it. From the smell, Stefan hadn't dried off much, just stewed in the damp, and now the whole truck interior was a mix of sweaty polyester and cheap cologne. At some point, Martin's phone vibrated. He fished it out from inside the pocket without lifting his face from the glass. A new message from his mom. Just a pixel-thin bar at the top of the screen. He thumbed it open and read, "Glad you got a ride. Be careful. Dad says don't accept food from strangers. Love you." Martin stared at the words, the last 3 letters burning into his retinas. He wanted to reply, but couldn't find a form of the phrase that didn't sound like a lie. He let the phone go dark. The truck burrowed through miles of darkness, past towns Martin recognized only as names on a highway sign. Hanover, Göttingen, Kassel. Occasionally, blue lights from a Polizei car flashed out of the night, illuminating the interior in surgical flickers. Mostly, it was just black. The highway an artery with nothing on either side. Hours ticked away. Eventually, Martin's knees developed a dull, radiating ache from being braced against the glove box. He shifted, trying to find a new position, but the seat was engineered for larger bodies, for real truckers instead of hitchhiking stowaways. There was a notch in the armrest where, if Martin leaned exactly right, he could wedge his elbow and almost relax. He bet the real pros could sleep in motion, eyes open, heads bobbing with the sway. He'd never learned that trick. There was a dashboard clock, glowering in green. At 2:06, the rain finally thinned, smeared to a mist on the glass. The landscape inched from pitch black to a dirty blue. Martin watched the exit signs count down to Kassel Ost, every kilometer a small mercy. "Piss break," Karl Heinz grunted, as if it needed saying. He coasted the rig through a near-empty lot, parked between 2 fellow behemoths, and cut the engine. Martin's ears rang with the sudden hush. Stefan surfaced, groggy, groped for his glasses, then blinked hard at the dashboard clock. "Seriously? Only 3 hours?" He sounded post-surgery, slurred and sore. Karl Heinz smirked, then jerked a thumb at the bathrooms visible through the vapor-hazed lot. 5 minute, boys too." Then he produced a battered thermos from the footwell, unscrewed the lid, and chugged half of it before capping it again. Martin climbed out, the abrupt cold shocking his knees. Rain still sticky, but more of a wet mist now. The lot was nearly empty. Just their rig, two more, and a single small hatchback idling near the exit. Lights on, but no movement inside. The Rastov's building hulked out of the gloom, its windows bandaged with condensation. He crossed the lot quick, Stefan shuffling close behind, both stepping around the miry puddles he knew would swamp their socks. Inside the building was warm and smelled like urinal pucks and gingerbread. Martin blinked under the migraine of strip lights, following the sprawl of arrows on the floor until he found the gents. Stefan slumped against the wall, massaging the bridge of his nose, as if the pressure might squeeze out all of the day. Martin turned into the stall, locked it. His knees still buzzed from the engine vibration. Down here, it was so quiet he could hear each drop hit the water, the distant freight train groan of a hand dryer. He leaned his head against the cool, graffitied tile and told himself he was fine. It was all normal. This was an adventure. Everyone was alive. He came out and rinsed his hands at a sink the size of a salad bowl. The mirror was too blunt for mercy. Someone had keyed a curse word into the glass, right at forehead level. He stared through it, then turned to Stefan, who looked up, face a little less shadowed, but eyes pink-rimmed. "It's like the weirdest camping trip ever," Stefan said, voice thin and echoey. "Didn't think you'd actually get us this far?" Martin tried to think of something better than "yeah," but nothing came. He stared at his shoes, realizing they had in fact lost the fight with the puddles. His socks were cold, and he could already smell the mildew. There was a bite at his throat, but he made himself smile anyway. "I bet in the Middle Ages, a pilgrimage to Paris was like 3 years. We're setting a speed record." Stefan blew air out his cheeks. In the Middle Ages, they'd just die at the first truck stop. True. Martin let his hands rest on the edge of the sink, feeling for a stable center. "If you want to just, not go back to the truck, I get it," Martin said, voice more gravel than before. "We could just sleep here, or catch a train if you want." There was a slow exhale from Stefan, and for a moment he didn't move at all. Then he straightened up, clamped his hands into his jacket pockets, and said, "We're not quitting." He made it sound like a curse. "Okay," Martin said, not trusting himself to add anything else. He almost told Stefan about the message from his mom, decided it wasn't worth it. They did what people in transit always did, zipped up, shouldered their bags, and walked out in search of their borrowed life. The parking lot looked emptier than before. The truck sat in its puddle like a grounded whale. Martin trudged over, half expecting it to be gone. But the cab was still faintly lit, and, as he clambered up the steel steps, he saw Karl Heinz sprawled back in the driver's seat, eyes half closed. He blinked awake in an instant, like he'd never actually been out, and barked, "Boys, go now?" As if sleep was an error to be covered up. He started the engine, slotted the gears, and they were moving before Martin could even process it. There was a flash of guilt, leaving the bathroom so quickly, not giving Stefan the pause to collect himself. But it dissolved in the adrenaline of escape. The storm had tapered to a low, persistent drizzle, which somehow made the world feel more permanent. Less like they might just blink and find themselves back in the schoolyard with nothing to show but ruined sneakers. The highway south of Kassel reminded Martin of a documentary he'd watched on salt mining. Endless tunnels, everything a monotone, only the glint of a headlamp to suggest depth. This was the same. Just variations of gray, darkness, and the machine logic of headlights carving out distance and time. At first, Martin counted down the stretches between rest areas, Gießen, Limburg, one with a name he couldn't pronounce. But the kilometers did not make sense to his Danish brain, and eventually the numbers blurred to data, comfort food for the anxious. He wondered if it would be possible to blink for a whole hour and not remember it, the way you could on a particularly good gaming binge. He tested this, closing one eye until the world lightened and darkened with each sodium lamp they passed. He lost count. He stopped keeping track. At some point, Karl-Heinz flicked the stereo on and a pulse of Schlager music filled the cab. Martin tried not to laugh. The lyrics were pure running tap water, so simple he could almost piece together the meaning despite his last German grade being a D. The chorus was about a man who drove forever to see the one true woman. And Martin wanted to think it was ironic, but the driver was stone-faced about it, hands drumming the wheel perfectly in time. Stefan even started to hum along from the bunk. Maybe a joke, maybe not. Martin tried sleep, which failed. He took out his notebook and filled 3 pages with variations of his own signature, then drew a diagram of the route so far, tiny carrots and hashtags for every pit stop. He tried to imagine Paris, what it would look like through this kind of weather. Some of the stations, Montparnasse, Saint-Lazare, and others. Lazare were so famous that even the names made him feel more awake, like inhaling static. He wanted so badly to keep moving, to have proof. He wanted to text his mom again, but the signal bars were gone, replaced by a 0 and a shape like a dying moon. At mile marker whatever, dawn started. The world out the window was gray, then yellow-gray, then something close to peach. It stained even the horizon. Stefan rolled over, muttered, "Shit," which seemed to summarize the night, the trip, the past 4 months of life in general, and then Stefan sat up, blearily wiping fog from the window. Is that fog, or am I still concussed? Martin craned over, saw what Stefan was seeing. The world out past the guardrail was mudflats and mist. Wheels of wind turbines lost in cloud. The sky the same color as toothpaste spit. Martin rubbed his own eyes. The clock on the dash said 5:16. They were somewhere south, definitely. The highway was emptier here, the trucks more spaced out, each one a visible threat instead of a herd. Karl-Heinz grunted, checked the mirrors, then muttered, "Soon you boys get out." He didn't elaborate. Martin tried to sit upright without making a show of how much his spine hated him. "Where are we exactly?" "Close Frankfurt," said Karl-Heinz, and for an instant the man's face softened. He ran his tongue along the inside of his cheek as if that might kickstart his English. "I'd drop you at airport. Good spot for next ride." He gripped the wheel tighter, then barked a laugh. "Lot of people want to go France from Frankfurt, yes?" Martin nodded like it was the best news anyone had ever told him. He almost said, "perfect," but the word dried out in his mouth. It was weird. The way being so close to their goal made his skin feel tighter than ever. Maybe it was the fog, or the lack of sleep, or maybe it was that he'd never actually believed this would work, that 2 kids could jump country by country on rides and luck and end up in the yellow mess of a German morning, about to cross into the rest of the world. He looked back at Stefan. Stefan's hair was even more absurd in the daylight, cowlicked and sweat-logged like he'd stuck his head in a blender and only barely survived. The guy looked alive, though, or at least more awake than he had last night. Karl-Heinz hummed something tuneless, cracked his knuckles, and the truck barreled down an off-ramp like it was chasing prey. Martin's brain skipped a beat. There was something jarring about the world being so awake. All these business travelers and coffee lines and neon fuel station banners after so many hours living in the slow, dark heartbeat of the truck. Even this early, the Frankfurt airport area buzzed. A pulse of taillights, the whine of airline shuttles, delivery vans in every loading zone like scavenger birds. The man drove them around the back, past lots labeled B and C, then under a watercolor bridge plastered with a Ryanair ad. He finally coasted up to a curb cut slashed with yellow paint and yanked the emergency brake. Everything stilled. Rain, engine, and the hush landed with a thunk. Martin felt his skull ringing with silence. Karl-Heinz reached across Martin's lap and jerked open the door, as if the thought of lingering even the extra 3 seconds triggered something primal and dangerous. "Good luck, boys," he said, and then, after a second, "Paris is not so far." The man's hand hovered in the air, not quite a handshake, and Martin clapped it anyway, out of obligation or gratitude or both. The skin was like hammered steel. He tumbled out, landing gracelessly on the curb. Stefan followed, blinking at the brightness. The terminal's glass and concrete cliff loomed overhead, full of mirrored shapes and shifting numbers. Martin turned just in time to see Karl-Heinz already lighting a new hand-rolled cigarette, already halfway back into the slipstream of his own life. The truck belched and faded, taillights pinwheeling into the early smog. Somewhere in the clouds, a plane screamed, invisible in the ceiling of mist, and for a second Martin wanted to go with it, departure for its own sake, the event horizon of travel. Stefan shoved his hands deep into his jacket and scanned the airport hinterlands, then said, "The bus to the city is..." He squinted at a digital sign, then shrugged. "It's blue. Maybe." Martin stretched, tried not to wince at the sharp electric aches radiating up his leg. "We could walk? It's probably like 4 kilometers. Or counterpoint," Stefan said, voice croaked dry by the lack of sleep. "We sit inside where it's not -1,000,000, and then we decide." He jerked his chin at the glass doors to the nearest terminal. "Unless you want pneumonia for the memories." Martin followed, the door hydraulics whooshing open to perfume-bright warmth, the sudden crush of people. The inside terminal was a football stadium of sound and motion, 100 languages echoing off the white tile and glass. Even the fluorescent light looked blue with the early hour, tinting the faces of businessmen and holidaymakers, and a wedding party whose suitcases blocked the main walkway. Stefan peeled left, toward a cluster of benches shaped like punctuation marks. Martin followed, heart jackhammering as the sheer number of people pressed in from every direction. He'd forgotten how much airports felt like the future. Plastic and steel and jittery, the scent of sugar and jet fuel. They dropped their packs on a bench and slumped like old men, calves tensed and hands shaking. Already, Martin could feel the ache building in his thighs, a fatigue that would turn to pain if he let it. Across the concourse, the arrivals board ticked through cities he'd only ever seen on TV. Geneva, Madrid, Istanbul. A pulse of possibility. All of it only hours away, all of it taunting him. Stefan cracked his neck, rubbing his hand along the seam of the bench, then started typing something on his phone with a speed that made Martin's fingers feel arthritic by comparison. He watched the departures board for a long minute. Bucharest, Madrid, Tel Aviv. Each city's name came paired with a gate and a time, and next to that, a status. Delayed, boarding, gate open. It felt like the whole continent was a single room where every person he'd ever met might be passing through at any time. But he and Stefan were alone, floating on a bench in Roside. He reached into his pack for the last of the vending machine snacks, a sleeve of Milka bars, slightly crushed. He peeled it open, broke a piece, ate it, then passed the rest to Stefan. "Chocolate for breakfast," he said. "Exotic." Stefan just grunted, but took a piece anyway. For a while they sat in the silence, listening to the glassy noise of the terminal, neither of them willing to say this was the end, not yet. Martin double-checked his phone. 1 bar of charge, the battery icon like a threat. He scrolled aimlessly, swiping between a family WhatsApp and Google Maps and the last saved screenshot of their route. The blue line snaked through 2 countries and ended here, paused like it expected him to pick up the thread. He wanted to tell someone, his parents, Rune, maybe even Jensen, that he'd done it, that the game wasn't just a joke, but he didn't type. He watched the status icons rotate, a slot machine of nothing. Stefan pulled his hood off, hair standing up in electric clumps, then rubbed the base of his skull with both hands. "You ever wonder if we're just insane?" he said, not even whispering. Martin shrugged. "I think it's genetic. On my dad's side, probably." He made a show of checking his arms for bite marks. "We're supposed to do dumb shit at least once." Stefan rolled his eyes, but in that way where the muscle tension dropped out after. Just wondering if I'm going to have to lie to my mom forever now." He made it a joke, like always, but Martin could hear the aftertaste. They watched the terminal fill in real time. First the suit-wrapped men with regulation hair, then the families with duffels and damp energy, then a column of American tourists wearing matching safety green lanyards. It was like a game. Guess who would be the next to spill coffee? Who would cry? Who would sprint for a gate and miss it by 1 minute? Martin kept the mental tally, half out of boredom and half because the alternative was thinking about the rest of the day. He'd never been to Paris. He'd never been anywhere. This felt like cheating. At 8:10, Martin thought he could feel his entire body start to vibrate on a molecular level from the hunger and nerves and Milka-Bar, and the sensation was not pleasant or cinematic. It was like the chemical sizzle in your head when you realized you'd said something embarrassing 3 years ago, except it was happening in real time, and the audience was the entire population of the Frankfurt International. He finished the chocolate in 3 bites, then licked the wrapper clean. Stefan made a face but didn't comment, only hoisted his pack onto his lap and began to unzip compartments and reshuffle gear like he was prepping for an Ironman. Martin watched the hands. They were steady now, the shakes from last night replaced with something methodical, nearly bored. Which made sense. They'd made it out, hadn't they? All the drama of the truck stops and the rain and the maybe murderers and even the cartoon emotional peaks of last night, all of it was already a speed blur in Stefan's rear view. Martin wondered how long it would take to fade, or if he'd always walk around with a tiny diesel engine spinning behind his lungs. Time was as unstable as ever. Sometimes a minute ballooned into a year, sometimes an hour vanished on the exhale. They sat, sometimes talking, sometimes just staring at the arrivals board, watching the sun rise dull and scratchy through the high terminal glass. An old woman sat down beside them for exactly 6 minutes, then was replaced by a backpacker in a sweat-stained MTV shirt. At some point, Stefan ripped open a granola bar and offered half. Martin took it, mouth too dry to chew, but he tried. When he managed to swallow, it was like the glue unsealed in his brain, and the words returned. "We need to figure out how to get the rest of the way," he said. He'd meant it casually, but the edge of desperation cut through. "Guess we'll take the bus to get anywhere near the next truck stop," Stefan countered. Martin turned it over in his mind. Last night's bravado drained out in the Arctic light of the terminal. "Let's just get out of the glass box first." He tried to say it like a joke, but his voice was too flat, as if the airport's recycled air had sanded off the edges. Outside, the arrivals loop was a riot of taxis and buses atomizing through puddles. The rain wasn't falling so much as being flung sideways. Martin hunched his shoulders, cinched the hood tight, and they hit the crosswalk. Each step sucked water through the soles, and by the time they made it to the bus shelter, his feet felt embalmed. Stefan eyed the route map, lips moving as he scanned, then squinted at the digital readout. "Bus 61 to Sud," he murmured, then louder. "Other side of the airport." Then a bit of a hoof. Martin tried to picture the actual map in his head and came up blank, but nodded anyway. "Yeah, okay." They paused at the shelter, rain pelting the plexi roof with machine gun rhythm. There was a man inside, pink bald head, navy suit stretched hard around the shoulders, earbuds pushed so deep they might never come out. He didn't even glance up. They stood in silence, steam rising off their coats in slow plumes. Each bus as it pulled up was a different flavor of humanity. Airport staff, a clutch of Turkish women with shopping bags, businessmen with Amazon-branded duffels. Martin wondered, watching them board, whether anyone ever looked at him and Stefan and thought, "That's what I want to be." Doubtful. When their bus arrived, it was empty except for a guy in a reflective vest, stretched across 2 seats, and a teenage couple making out in the back row, oblivious to the world. Stefan led the way, dropping into the row nearest the rear exit, leaving Martin a choice. Either right across from the snoring vest guy, or right in front of Stefan. He chose the latter, dropping his pack to the floor and sinking back as far as the plastic bench allowed. The bus hissed through gears, merged with the ant farm grid of microcars and delivery vans, then veered away from the airport. The world drained behind glass. Gray flats of warehouse, flecks of scrub pine, then compacted blocks of apartment buildings that looked like they'd been copied and pasted from one city to another. Martin watched as the terminal vanished in a haze of jet fuel and low cloud. He didn't feel relief. Not exactly. The city outside was scrubbed and bland, like the inside of a refrigerator, but it was better than the manic echo of the terminal. The bus trundled through a ring of roundabouts, past shuttered bakeries and playgrounds wrapped in orange snow fencing. Martin drifted in and out, tried to catch fragments of Stefan's muffled calls from 2 rows back, but everything blurred into the hum of the motor and the low, airless heat. He'd never been so tired in his life. It was the kind of fatigue that pooled behind the eyes, a sludgy pressure that made it hard to track time. He scrolled through his phone for a while, checked the weather in Paris, checked his messages, dead, checked the news. Some basketball player had just been bought for a record sum. The war in Ukraine was still a war. He wondered for the 1,000th time whether his mom was actually tracking him, or if she'd already compartmentalized this whole thing as just another Martin idiocy, better not to ask. He glanced at Stefan 2 seats away, head propped against the window, earbuds in, mouth open a little. His phone pulsed with some ancient mobile game, one of those falling block puzzle games that always looked like a migraine. Martin tried to memorize the contours of the back of Stefan's head, as if that made up for getting them stranded here in the first place. The ache behind his eyes got worse. Their stop came up at the edge of a district called New Eisenberg, which Martin guessed was named by whichever Eisenberg came first and found it underwhelming. The bus dropped them at a roundabout, sweating under the glare of a Lidl sign. In every direction, suburban Germany did its absolute best to be less interesting than the last. Martin dragged his pack to the sidewalk. The air stunk of wet tar and something sweet that reminded him of his grandmother's laundry soap. Stefan pointed down a spur road, the sidewalk running as a stripe between parked vans and the occasional feverishly green verge. "I think it's half an hour that way," he said. His voice was rebooted, almost normal, except he was walking faster than Martin could walk, his own pack lashed so tight to his shoulders it looked welded on. Martin followed, every step a negotiation between the ache in his tendons and the quickening pulse of not wanting to be left behind, not even for a second. They passed a row of car dealerships, each one aggressively empty, the flags outside snapping half-heartedly in the wet wind. The drizzle had started again, finer, almost invisible, but it pricked at Martin's cheeks and crept into the space between his collar and his neck. He wanted a hot shower, or failing that, a liter of vending machine coffee. Both felt equally imaginary. A line of hedges opened onto the kind of highway lay-by that Martin's dad used to describe as where history goes to die. The trucks here were smaller, more regional, deliveries for the supermarket, 2 IKEA vans mating in parallel, a high-roofed Sprinter with a faded graphic of a dog on its side panel. Past the hedges, rain had an edge, less like water and more like a conspiracy. Martin's shoulders stung from the pack. He flexed his fingers until they stopped shaking, checked the lot 3 times as they walked the perimeter. He kept looking for a miracle, maybe a helium-yellow Poland-bound trucker or someone on a break, eyes bored enough to take a risk. There was no one. The only sign of life was a woman in a red housecoat up on a 3rd-floor balcony, vaping and scrolling her phone, oblivious. Martin figured diplomacy ended the second you entered a Rasthof at sunrise, still smelling of yourself, with sleep marks creasing your face like topographic lines on a bad map. There was no way you could bluff the staff, clinical in their efficiency, immune to every variety of traveler's desperation. Every surface in this pit-stop cafeteria flashed glassily under the overheads. The coffee machine wheezed behind the counter, and everything about the place dared you to ask for more than you paid for. Stefan, half shut and blue-fogged from the bus, zeroed in on an empty 2-top in the rear. Martin followed, noticing that even the tables bore scars. Carved names, runes, One attempt at a dick pic rendered in ballpoint and gouged resin. The only other customers were long-haul drivers, two men in matching safety vests and a lone woman in a crisp navy uniform. She sat under an ancient Mertz banner, spooning at thick, grit-colored porridge, face slack. Martin could feel the institutional challenge in her posture. Dare to complain, see what happens. She radiated the energy of someone who'd seen the world settle for less and decided to call it a favor. He ordered by finger-pointing and a muttered 2 coffees, then paid in coins slippery from the flight of his palm. The girl behind the counter took the money, neither smiling nor breaking stride. She passed the cups in a movement so swift that it almost snatched the air from his hands. The coffee tasted of burnt earth and microwave Monday. It was perfect. They drank in silence, Stefan's head down, tapping at his phone. Martin watched the windows, counting trucks bleeding west along the Autobahn, hearing in each distant engine the certainty of direction, a confidence that nagged at him. Every so often, one of the drivers at the front would bark laughter across the room, the sound echoing off the diner's miniature cathedral, though Martin could not decipher the punchline. He let his ears dull to it, focusing on the coffee-burning tracks down his throat and the acidic buzz building at the top of his stomach. "What's the next move?" Stefan finally asked, his voice nothing but vibrating chords, the rest of him on autopilot. Martin angled his head at the line of windows. "There's a truck depot across the lot, probably our best shot." He tried to say it like a plan instead of the improvisation it was. Stefan made a sound. Was it agreement or just swallowing? Then snapped his phone onto the table, screen down. "We could just walk. Take a train for the last bit." Martin almost flinched. There was a limit to what he'd admit, especially now, but the thought of trudging through kilometers of industrial park, 100 versions of this same stop, made something harden inside him. He looked around, didn't see the navy-suited woman move, but she was suddenly at the register, loading 2 liters of black coffee into a travel flask with the same violence someone might use to reload a gun. Her hair looked like it had been attacked by a blender, but her eyes stenciled a perfect perimeter around the room. She breathed heavy, then snapped something at the counter girl, spat a laugh, and made for the door. Martin couldn't ignore her because she was exactly the kind of person who didn't want to be ignored. He finished his coffee in a mouthful that left his tongue raw and tapped Stefan's hand. "Come on, before every slot fills up." Stefan shoved his phone in his coat. Together, they traversed the linoleum dead zone to the vestibule, and Martin tried to match the woman's speed, but she'd already broken ahead, boots sparking as they hit the wet. The lot was full of horizontals, lines of trucks and vans, each painted with a different variation on disappointment. The air still so ragged from rain it bit at Martin's teeth. He zipped his jacket to the nose and kept close to the awning, partly because it sheltered his face, mostly because the world didn't feel particularly invested in his continued existence now that every step forward cost so much. The woman in the navy uniform stood at the curb, hunched over a battered opal with the logo half peeled from its flank. She held her travel mug like a weapon, sucking at the steam with deep, pessimistic pulls. She noticed Martin and Stefan only as footnotes, eyes flicking past them to the row of trucks beyond the drainage ditch. Martin forced a nod. He almost said, "Good morning," but it curdled on his tongue. She looked at them, considered, then said, "You're trying for a ride?" In perfect nasal English. Martin startled, then remembered he still had his mouth, too, and nodded. The woman took another drag on her mug. Her uniform had a name badge, one of those pin-on types with nothing but E. Mueller in tired Helvetica. Martin stared at it just long enough for her to notice. "You'll have better chances if you ask in the loading area." She jerked her chin at the depot, then squinted through the ruts of rain running off the awning. "Though you might get lucky with the Hungarians over there." She pointed, not even turning her shoulders, at a clump of trucks with a flag-draped cab, men smoking under a tarp strung with bootlaces. Martin worked his jaw. "Appreciate it. We just made it from, well, Denmark, so we're nearly there." "Nobody ever wants to get to Germany," Miller said. It's always just passing through. She rattled the lid of her mug, and Martin watched her smile without showing teeth. You should bring pastries next time, or cigarettes. They like that. Martin nodded. He felt the sweat inside his layers cooling on contact with the air. Thanks, he said. Miller's gaze already skipped to the next detail. She belonged to the world that didn't require acknowledgement. Stefan muttered, "That was weirdly helpful," once they were clear of the curb. Martin grunted, unwilling to cede even a little admiration to someone who could fillet them with one glance. They crossed through the corridor of chugging diesel and stray wrappers, each step pocking through minor lakes and the residue of last night's weather. Up close, the Hungarian trucks looked less tactical than the woman had made them sound. The drivers wore soccer jackets and pastel sweatpants, their faces young and unshaven, more bored than menacing. Martin tried to gauge the best angle of approach. A group or a lone one? He'd read that you should come at the cluster, like you were already part of it. He picked the one at the edge, leaned against a trailer staring at his phone. Blue track jacket, Adidas. Hair buzzed so close the scalp freckled through. He stopped a pace off, raised a hand, and said, "Hello." His voice cracked on the second syllable, turning it childlike. The guy didn't look up for a second, then thumbed off the phone and smiled, slow and tired. "English?" Martin tried. The man offered a shrug, then a deliberate, "Little bit, yes." The accent was particulate, like gravel in the space between words. Martin outlined their needs with a pantomime. Southbound, anywhere past the Rhine, preferably to France. The man scanned him, then Stefan held their faces in a kind of blank expectation. After a beat, the man looked back at the depot, then at his own hand, twisting the phone. The man leaned out from the shadow of his truck, looked them over, and Martin could see the seconds passing in his eyes. A whole internal process probably involving probability, risk, or just the sheer inconvenience of talking to anyone at 7 a.m. The guy tucked his chin inside his jacket and said, "I go to Strasbourg today. Can drop, on the way, if you want. Need to leave soon, though." He pronounced Strasbourg in a way that melted the consonants. Martin blinked. He'd expected more resistance, maybe a negotiation, or at least an excuse about insurance. "That would be very good," he said, the words crumbling at the end. He shot a glance at Stefan, who, to his credit, managed to smile. The man nodded once, then jerked his head at the cab. "Wait there," he said, then returned to his phone like the conversation never happened. Martin and Stefan moved aside, let the drivers. Watched them while the time dilated, the waiting suddenly geological. Stefan did laps around his own feet, biting a thumbnail, the color rimming his eyes now almost navy. Martin tried to focus on the heat from the truck's radiators, envying their self-contained ecosystem. There was the weird sense of victory, and also the psychic hangover that always hit after a risk paid out. The feeling you'd borrowed something from the future and now owed the universe interest. The Hungarian clambered back into his cab after a 3-minute warning from the depot. A horn blast, flat and ugly. And Martin and Stefan circled to the passenger side, not wanting to jump the gun. The guy stuck his head out the window, gestured with a can of Monster, and said, "You have water or snack?" Is a long way. Then to clarify, no stop for many kilometers. Martin nodded. He'd packed a Gatorade and 2 sad granola bars. Stefan produced the remains of a supermarket pack of Haribo. Martin tried to remember if this was considered healthy and safe, or instant diabetes, decided it was both, and wrapped an arm around his pack to show they were set. A minute later, the guy cranked his window and signaled them up. Martin had to hike himself up a full knee's height. Truck cabs were built for people with a Stairmaster's DNA. The inside was at once boiled dry and humid with human vapor. Stefan slid in, folding himself beside Martin with the ease of someone born in car back seats. The Hungarian tapped at the phone, then turned and made eye contact like someone clicking a laser pointer over a whiteboard. "Name is Balaz," he said. He was probably 25, but the lines at his eyes made him look twice that first thing in the morning. "Martin." "Stefan." Small nod, then he keyed the ignition. The rig rumbled into life with a signboard clang and a shudder, the motion submerging Martin's kneecaps in instant vibration. Balaz checked mirrors, twisted the big wheel with a single finger catch, and nosed the truck out of the ruts. He didn't waste time with warm-ups, just straight onto the feeder road, then an abrupt dart left onto an on-ramp that Martin would have chickened out of on a bike. For the first 10 minutes, there was nothing but the hiss of weather and the bounce of chassis. The highway outside looked scrubbed for speed. Empty lanes, the odd flock of commuters, then kill zones of uninterrupted tarmac. The dash was a plastic archipelago of buttons, all bandaged with bits of tape and faded stickers. One with a cartoon girl, another just the word Kovacs in marker. Martin watched Balaz run the wheel, one thumb always on the horn toggle, and tried to absorb the tempo. Balaz's truck was a white box on a white road, running 100 kilometers per hour through a world that only occasionally remembered to include color. The mist didn't so much sit on the fields as melt them, and the only way Martin could tell one town from the next was the slightly different chemical bite of their air, burping through the cab's vents with every shift in wind. He learned, by watching, by imitation, by a sort of monkey see, monkey don't, how to sit still for these distances. The cab had no right angles. Everything slouched, sagged, or rounded, as if the design brief had been, lull the driver into a gentle sense of non-existence. Balaz drove with robotic smoothness, every lane change and acceleration a single, unbroken gesture. When he spoke, it was mostly in fragments. Bad road here, or long tunnel coming. Or, at one point, police check, very common, as a flock of blue lights staged a roadblock up ahead. Martin tensed, then remembered he was neither smuggling drugs nor a war criminal, and tried to loosen his jaw. The truck wound south, through flats and barren windbreaks, the geometry of Germany peeling past the windows. At each sign, Martin counted down the kilometers. He fished snacks from his pack, a granola bar, 2 sour strips, divided them with Stefan, and for a while they just chewed and watched kilometer stones annihilate under the truck's appetite. Balaz ate nothing, drank the monster in 2 staccato sips, then ran on what Martin reckoned could only be pure determination and a history of low-level amphetamines. There was comfort in the sameness. Every rest area looked like every other. The world outside was a slide deck of minor variations. For a couple of hours, Martin didn't think about the end, or the beginning, or whether anything had changed since yesterday. At some point, Balaz started humming. It was tuneless, a sort of nasal buzz that wove between the engine's own drone, and Martin recognized it as the anthem of the perpetually underslept. The truck crested a viaduct and the landscape fell open. A sudden sprawl of power stations and memory-wiped new construction. The kind of empty that felt like an error. Martin looked for any sign of old Germany, the one from school books, but it was gone under all that concrete and glass. Stefan at his side stayed mostly dormant. Sometimes he made small noises. Throat clears, the kind of almost words that could be interpreted as still alive, but never built them into sentences. Martin started a tally of these, just to keep his brain from fossilizing. Midday was a pale blur on the dash clock. At the edge of a field, Martin saw a tiny chapel, its roof the color of cut brick, the walls like a slice of red barely resisting the fog. He pointed at it and made a noise, then turned to Stefan. But Stefan was in that interior space, mouth tight, knuckles pressed white on the seat. Martin wanted to say something, make it significant, but the words crumbled in transit. He let it go. Instead, he kept counting the kilometer markers, watching the black number drop, drop, drop. Lunch, if you called it that, happened with no formality. Balaz stopped at a pullover where the forest crowded right up to the tarmac, and Martin's legs nearly buckled from the effort of climbing down. The air snapped with cold, pine needles shivering on every gust. There were rows of empty picnic tables, a toilet shed, nothing else. Ballas locked the cab, then pissed against the edge of the forest, unbothered by the world or the threat of a passing family. Stefan looked like he wanted to sink into the mulch and not come back. Martin bummed a piss behind the shed, then washed up at the frigid tap while Stefan sulked by a railing, phone clutched but dead. 15 minutes, Ballas said, then vanished into his cab. Martin tried to stretch out the time, moving in slow circles, shaking out his legs, staring up at the drift of cloud. He counted the crows perched on the power line. He thought about how this all felt like a dare. How far could you go before the universe called your bluff? Not far, if you were a crow. But if you were Martin, you had to pretend there was always another kilometer left, always another rumbling truck waiting to take you there. He munched a granola bar, waited for the gluey mass to unstick from the back of his teeth, then walked back to Stefan. "You good?" he said. Stefan's voice was rough when he answered. Gravel in a stream, all the smoothness worn out. "Yeah, just cold." He pulled at the zipper of his coat, teeth snapping at the metal like it would help. "My phone's fucked." "Water." He didn't elaborate, and Martin didn't ask. The hunger that had been pacing his insides all morning now sulked in the back of his throat. They killed the break in 5-minute increments. Ballas in the cab with the radio on. Stefan hunched over the bench, and Martin walking the perimeter, counting paces and trying to work warmth back into his legs. The only thing moving besides them was a squirrel, which made a big show of hopping across the damp grass, tail electric with static. It was either the bravest animal alive or just missing a survival instinct. Martin watched until it bolted up a tree and vanished. Back in the truck, the air was still saturated with whatever industrial air freshener. They got moving, wheels grating against gravel, and after a few kilometers, Martin's arms stopped prickling. For nearly an hour, all conversation narrowed to nothing. Martin marked the milestones by the taste of old granola in his teeth and the steady throb around the base of his skull. Only when Ballas started to cough did Martin realize they were close to Strasbourg. The city jutted up from the flats, all glass organs and antennae, more French than German already. Martin tried to see the border, but the world refused to clarify. Every overpass and feeder looked like the last. No gates, no guards, nothing to announce that you'd crossed from one empire to another. He wondered if maybe he'd slept through it. He blinked twice, trying to clear the silence from his head. Ballas took the truck off the highway and wound it down a bandaged industrial road. The concrete building so low and ugly it made Martin's chest ache inside, his ribcage vibrating with the memory of 100 roadside lunches, and none of them wanting to be here. They got off in the lee of a truck services plaza, as underwhelming as the rest, but with a view of the river and a pedestrian bridge arcing east-west, just visible through the factory haze. Martin thanked Ballas, who barely nodded, already reaching for something in the glove box. He and Stefan huddled against the wind, backpacks heavier now that the finish line was in sight, and watched the truck bellow away, leaving them alone with their own breath and the taste of it. The last leg. Strasbourg was supposed to be a city of stories, something Martin's dad had said once, but all he could see was the geometry of traffic. Circles, lines, lights on timers. It was almost funny how the last 100 kilometers felt longer than the entire rest of the continent. Martin huddled against the window of the gas station, eyelids pulsing in time with the vending machine's hum, watching Stefan gnaw a pencil into splinters while he mapped out the options on a napkin. 2 trains, or find a trucker. "We might actually have to run," Stefan said, flattening the map and tracing the route with chewed nails. It was past 4 already, and the sun angled in like a deadline. They'd burned through every currency and battery pack, and already the air between them was gritted with too many hours awake. Martin's last cup of coffee vibrated under his skin. He watched the parking lot, waiting for someone interesting. The rest of the world seemed both close enough to spit on and too far to ever reach. The only other customer in the relax zone was a pale, 50-something guy in a rumpled banana-yellow cycling jersey, half asleep in a beanbag chair. Martin found himself hypnotized by the guy's shoes, neon green, scuffed to hell, even brighter when the light refracted off the linoleum. He caught himself thinking about home, about the sudden normalcy of his brother's shoes lined up by the radiator, and how even that now seemed alien. He pinched the bridge of his nose hard and tried to focus on Stefan's voice, which was currently narrating the bus times in a monotone. Or, if we miss the 6:16, we're basically dead until tomorrow, Stefan said, dark under the fluorescence. The napkin map now bled through with a constellation of nervous sweat. We could try the ring tram, but I think we'd end up. Martin blinked at the map, then at Stefan's finger, as if the route would change just by wishing it. What if we just cab it? He said, more as a joke, but Stefan chewed it for a solid 5 seconds. With what, your charming personality? Stefan snapped, then glared at the half-shredded napkin. We're at literal €0 now. Unless we pawn your jacket. Martin glanced at the navy windbreaker, its sleeves streaked with damp and scribble, the only thing holding his body together at this point. He fingered the frayed cuff and thought about calling it quits, just curling up by the radiator like a lost dog. He could almost feel the heat on his knees. He scanned the lot again. The gas station had slipped into a lull. Post-lunch, pre-commuter. The only sign of life was a sharp-angled woman behind the counter, frowning at her phone, and the neon cyclist guy who had now rotated to face the forecourt, legs crossed and glassy-eyed like he was monitoring the fuel pumps for existential threats. Martin figured if the man had anywhere better to be, he'd have found it by now. Stefan massaged his temples, then rolled his head toward the window. We still have to cross the perimeter. If we're on foot, that's 45 minutes, and most of the path is construction. And mud. Martin watched the clock above the coffee station stutter to 16:07. His body disagreed with the math, insisting there was still an eternity left. He considered the merits of just walking, tramping the shoulder all the way to the city, weaving between dead hedgerows and whatever zone of concrete gave way to France proper. It had a so bad it's good logic to it, at least until the wind picked up. That's when the sense memory of Copenhagen rain clawed at him. The ache of it, the way cold wormed under your skin and pooled wet inside your elbows. Martin looked down at his hands. His fingernails were blue underneath. Let's just stick to the plan, he said. Let's stick to the long-haul drivers and see. If we can find a truck, that gets us to Paris. Again with the trucks, Stefan muttered, but he didn't fight it. He balled up the napkin and missed the waste bin by a meter, then hiked his bag over one shoulder. Martin braced for sarcasm, but there was nothing left in the tank. Outside, the wind came at them without even the decency to bring a scent. Just blank, moving air, muggy with the memory of 1,000 passing freights. In the lot, the rigs parked with mathematical precision. Scania, Mercedes, a powder blue Renault. It was always the same brands, the same leagues of sleepwalking men orbiting their bumpers, flicking cigarettes or picking at their teeth. Martin steered them down the row, hopping puddles, scanning for a cab with a human shape inside. He kept his eyes peeled for the flags, the air fresheners, the affectations that showed a driver didn't mind standing out. Something a little weird, a little desperate. There, a red Volvo, mud-spattered, its fenders decaled with 2 faded Danish flags and a cartoon chicken that, on scrutiny, wore sunglasses and a halo. Martin locked on, guided by a notional gravitational field that linked all weirdos in the universe. He changed course, and Stefan followed on a half-second delay, like a moon caught by a fresh planet. When Martin peered through the window, the driver was not only awake, but polishing the dashboard with a yellow microfiber rag. He looked up, clocked Martin instantly, and put the rag down with a gesture that was both dismissal and invitation. Martin opened with, "Hej," then realized he was halfway between German, Danish, and English, and if he didn't pick fast, the rest of the sentence would garble in his mouth. "Hey," the driver replied, accent pure enough for home. His hair was buzzed white blonde, face foxed with road weather. The words settled, and the man gave a little nod, like he approved of the attempt. "You are Danish?" he said, voice rough but not unfriendly. Martin nodded. "Martin," he said, "we are going to Paris. Or as near to it if we can." He pointed at Stefan, who offered a tired hedge through chattering teeth. "We are." Martin struggled for the word, then landed on hitchhikers. The driver grinned, full teeth, gold in one canine. "Jakob Jensen," he said, then repeated it, like he was reading his own name for the first time in a while. He wore a thick old man's fleece zipped to the throat and a pair of gold wire glasses that were both grandpa and cop. He said, "Jump in, we can leave now," and unlocked the cab with a clunk so decisive it felt tactical. Stefan climbed in first, then Martin. The cab smelled of stale bread, window cleaner, and something sharp, sour, like ammonia. Martin clambered up, shoes skidding on the step, and settled next to Stefan on the jump seat behind the driver. Everything in this cab vibrated, even when the engine was off. Stickers crowded every square centimeter. Logos for football clubs, cartoon animals, a tiny dancing Jesus. On the dashboard, a single shriveled clove of garlic dangled from the mirror, twitching with each movement of the cab. Jakob Jensen started the engine with a throat-clearing rumble, then patted the wheel like it was a dog needing reassurance. "I'm going to a depot north of Paris. In Reims. Delivery for tomorrow. If you want to go to the city, you'll need to take the train from there." He looked at them in the mirror, scanning their faces, making quick mental calculations. He smiled, wide and sharp. "Does that work for you guys?" "Perfect," Martin said, and nudged Stefan's knee. Stefan mumbled something that could have been awesome or sure, whatever, and Martin felt a jolt, as if the whole day was resetting around a new axis. The rig lurched alive, and they coasted slowly out of the gas station and into the bone-flat country. The cabin wasn't exactly warm, but the cold was now something shared and transformed by diesel and body heat. For a long time, Jensen said nothing, just drove. The main road funneled them west, past strip malls and silos, and a McDonald's built like a half-scale refugee camp. Martin watched water thread down the glass, wondered what it would be like to live your life in motion, to make a home out of this endless humming chassis. At the first traffic light, Jensen reached behind the seat and handed them a bag of Haribo. "For the road," he said, like it was both a joke and a test. Martin tore the bag open, the smell of food, dye, and sugar a raw flash against the chlorine tang of Jensen's aftershave. Stefan absently ate bears in colors not found in nature, chewing mechanically, gaze pinned to the fissures in the wet road. Jensen took every curve and roundabout as if fighting an invisible adversary, his hands never still. The radio spat news in rapid Danish. At the first kilometer marker, he said, "The French, they go on strike Monday. You should be in Paris before then, or it will be a catastrophe." He rolled the R like a tongue injury. Martin wondered if they had ever learned to drive this fast in driver's ed, or if life on the road just ground away the need for brakes. Beyond the glass, France was nothing like the romance of classroom posters. It was a Morse code of strobe-lit industry. Warehouses and distribution centers hammered out along every exit, bare trees and boxy apartments and a slurry of pitted access roads. They passed a slaughterhouse, its canted billboard showing cartoon pigs in happier times, then a string of unroofed concrete shells. Construction paused in the open. Outside the window, light oscillated, sometimes so bright it made Martin's retinas buzz. He thought about how Jensen, after less than 5 minutes, felt more familiar than half his own extended family. Maybe it was the nationality, or the thin membrane of rules and references that let a person prove they were one of the good ones. It wasn't trust, exactly, but more like compatibility of malaise. Martin could almost see the man's interior wiring. He wondered if this was how people ended up selling their souls for a company truck and a GPS tracker, drawn in kilometer by kindnesses that didn't even know themselves as kindness. At a bypass, the convoy thickened, a line of trucks snaking along the battered highway like an army of mutants bred for asphalt. Jensen fused into the pack, head craned slightly forward, gaze cycling between mirrors in a mosaic of micro-movements. In the back, Martin sank into the upholstery, prickle of adrenaline giving way to the fatigue that only road noise and monotony could birth. His body alternated between float and gravity, lull and spike, each kilometer a new opportunity for heartburn or hope. At the interstate merge, Jensen said, "If you want, you can rest. From here, the whole world is just a road to Paris." He tossed the words over his shoulder, voice casual, already gone by the time they landed. Martin tried to wedge himself sideways, knees bracketed by the heater duct and the console. Stefan had already slumped, chin tucked to collarbone. The drone of the cabin mixed with the compounded high of no sleep and too much everything, and for a while, Martin's mind simply let go. The vibration of road and plastic and gummy bears blotted out time. The dials on the dash glowed green, the numbers on the GPS ticking up, then down, then up again. Martin felt his sense of self smear across the seat and the window and the flickering highway signs. His left leg lost feeling. He couldn't tell if he was dozing or just caught in a feedback loop of noise and sugar, and it didn't matter. Sometimes Jensen would break the spell, flick on the radio or bark a laugh at a billboard, or just mutter to himself in a rhythm Martin barely recognized as language. Stefan was dead to the world, folded over his own midsection in a pose Martin's chiropractor uncle would have wept to see. Time passed in geological slices. Sometimes Jensen talked, not to fill silence, but as if testing whether anyone was awake. Martin kept waiting for the man to ask about his story, or his family, or his hoodie, or what music he liked. But Jensen didn't, and soon Martin stopped expecting it. The man was a node in the same network of silence and imperative that ruled every road since Denmark. If anything, Martin preferred it. Less risk of having to explain himself, or worse, be exposed for what he was, a 17-year-old runaway with no real plan, just a borrowed bravado and a head full of internet advice. The traffic thickened as they drew closer to the city. Sound and color sharpened. The rain let up, but the clouds hung low, mottled and backlit by the sodium glare of the trucks. Each rest stop along the A4 was a repeat of the last. Prefab building, branded flags, a scattering of orange-jacketed men, their faces etched by wind and fuck-you fatigue. When Jensen needed to refuel, he did it with the efficiency of a surgeon. Kill the engine, stretch his back, crack his knuckles. Martin took the opportunity to hit the bathroom, leaving the keys in the ignition like he was daring the universe to take the whole rig. Martin watched the man walk, hips set, stiff stride, the way he checked every angle before stepping into open space. The thought crept up. Maybe Jensen was running too. Martin pulled his phone, checked it again. Still dead, the screen nothing but a black mirror. He caught his own reflection, pale and unshaven, the shadows under his eyes so deep they belonged to another species. He wondered whether his mother had tried to call, if she was now in that weird hinterland between worry and denial. The idea thudded inside his skull, weightless and too heavy at once. He stuck the phone in his pocket and focused on the plastic ridges of the dash, tracing a sticky outline of an ancient football sticker with his finger. Jensen reappeared in the lot, shaking rain from his sleeves, and pulled himself up into the truck with a clank and a breath like he'd climbed Everest. He didn't even glance at Martin, just wound the window, tapped the wheel, and pulled back into the convoy as if he'd never left. "Would you mind if I plug my phone in for a charge?" Martin asked. Jensen responded, "Sure, go ahead. There's a spare charger in the glove box. Martin tried to say thank you, but the words glommed together, stuck in his mouth. He blinked, then nodded, then watched Jensen root around in the glove compartment until he produced the spare cable. A tiny curl of dust unwound when he handed it over. Martin shoved it into his phone and braced for the battery icon, that little green hope. The world outside flicked past. Barns with burnt-out roofs, stuttering wind turbines, a city's worth of half-built skeletons. The land had a hungry look, every surface wrung out by the wind. On the approach to Reims, the road shouldered past a battery of aging shopping centers and a casino masquerading as a medieval castle, then a logistics park where the trucks multiplied, orbiting in tight ellipses around a cluster of prefab offices. Jensen threaded into a side lane, dropped to a crawl, and parked with a finality that seemed to end not just the trip, but every trip. He put on the hazards, then turned in the seat. "This is it," he said, voice flat at first, then unexpectedly gentle enough to pull at something in Martin's chest. "I don't go farther. For Paris, you can take the RER from the station," he said, jerking a thumb at the exit ramp. "It's easy and cheaper than cab." He thought about the handshake ritual, or maybe some kind of salute, but Jensen just grunted and watched him with one eye, waiting for the goodbyes to finish. Martin shook Stefan awake, the process requiring 2 sharp pokes and a muffled, "What the?" And then they were out of the cab, feet hitting tarmac like they'd been dropped from a low flight. The truck's heat bled away instantly. Jensen waited just long enough to see their backs turned, then rolled the rig away, hazard lights blinking like a coded goodbye. They stood in a triangle of muddy verge, blinking at the landscape. The depot was a pale slab of concrete with 2 flags limp in a crosswind and no visible humans. Beyond it, the city. A glitter of wet roofs and radio towers, the spires of Reims Cathedral blurring into haze. Martin couldn't quite connect the reality to the names he'd circled on the napkin, couldn't connect his own body to the fact of having crossed an entire country by accident. Stefan looked at the station entrance and exhaled. "I feel like my skeleton is made of Twix bars." "I think we're 2 hours ahead of schedule," Martin said, and actually laughed, though it started as a cough. The interior of the truck stop vibrated with a kind of nervous energy. Late shift fluorescence, the stink of fryer oil and old rain, voices echoing off tile and plastic as if the place was built to make everyone sound more desperate. It bowled Martin over. How different the French version of these places was from the Danish ones. A kind of improvisational chaos. Teenage girls in red aprons and chipped nail polish, packs of drivers from a dozen countries all talking at once, and TVs on every wall, each set to a different sport. Martin tried to keep his field of vision narrow, found a table near the window, and staked it out with a wet backpack and a single packet of chewing gum. He figured this was the most French thing he could do. Declare territory, then sit and act unimpressed. Stefan lurked by the vending machines, watching a trio of Albanian drivers play some high-speed coin pusher game that echoed with each jackpot. Martin watched the floor show, the slapstick brutality of grown men flinging coins into a machine, the way every loss triggered a string of invented cusses, each more ornate than the last. Stefan's head was low, but his shoulders kept tensing. Martin could picture the thoughts pinballing behind his eyes, all risk calculations and exit strategies. First order of business, food, or the universe's approximation of it. Martin grabbed a tray, navigated a queue that was more scrum than line, and pointed at anything with enough protein to support a cardiac event. The counter girl didn't bother with small talk, just slapped down a double cheeseburger and fries, so hot they steamed the tray. Yellow cheese dripped everywhere, a river of it, like the meal was trying to escape its own fate. Martin paid, realized he was officially broke except for a handful of euro coins and the weird hunger that now seemed to colonize all available space in his body. He parked the tray at his table, fished out his notebook for cover, then started in on the fries. The food tasted like hot glue and regret. He ate anyway, compulsively, barely chewing. The cheese soaked into the bun, liquefying it into a kind of edible pudding, but it was still the best thing Martin had put in his mouth all week. The coffee, when it came, was so harsh he nearly spat it out, but it burned away the fuzz clotted at the corners of his brain. He glanced over the shoulder, searching for Stefan, still by the vending machines, but now with his back to the Albanians, reading something on his phone. The guy looked like a VR model of a teenager. Just enough twitch and hunch so that if anyone looked too long, the illusion would flake. Martin waved him over, but Stefan didn't notice, so Martin went back to the notebook, doodling a map of their next shot at Paris. After a few minutes, Stefan finally broke away from the machines, face compressed and colorless, and slouched into the seat across from Martin. He didn't look at the burger or the melting cheese, or even Martin's notebook, just fixed his gaze on a scar at the edge of the tabletop and traced it with his thumbnail. Martin waited, but Stefan said nothing, so Martin went for forced casual. "That was probably the most international crime scene I've ever witnessed," he said, jerking his chin at the coin pushers. Stefan snorted. "We're probably in the background of 3 Interpol files now." No laugh, but at least it was something. He yanked open a sugar packet and poured it straight into his mouth, like maybe his body would ignite if he just added the right catalyst. Martin pushed the coffee in Stefan's direction. "You look like you need this more than I do." Stefan gripped the cup but didn't drink. His voice went thin, almost underwater. "What's the plan now?" "You okay?" Martin said, then instantly regretting it. "I mean, are you coming?" He tried to make it a joke, but Stefan was unreadable, blinking too fast. "Yeah." Stefan drummed his fingers on the gloss tabletop. "Just tired. Don't want to get stuck here all night." Martin forced a grin. "This place reminds me of your last birthday party." Stefan looked up at him for the first time, face flickering with what might have been confusion, or maybe just the usual, "Why are you like this?" "There were more girls at my party," Stefan said, then, after a second, "and less murder." It was almost banter. Martin took the win, then grabbed his notebook, tapped the open page. "Okay, we're outside Rams, but we're still on the main east-west artery. If we hitch from here, we only need 1 more ride, maybe 2, to hit the ring road. After that, direct to Gare de Lyon, or Montparnasse, if we're unlucky." He glanced at the zigzag line he'd drawn, as if it mapped more than just roads. Stefan took a sip of the coffee. His face puckered, but he kept drinking. "And after that?" Martin heard the question behind the question. He pretended not to. He shrugged. "Then we walk to the hostel, check in, maybe eat something that doesn't come out of a deep fryer." "I told you it would work." Stefan didn't answer, just looked back at the vending machines. The Albanian men had moved on, and a new crowd had rotated in. 4 men in reflective vests and a solitary woman with plastic gloves, scrubbing the glass with pampered apathy. The night was thinned out now, the floor mostly empty except for the odd man in a suit with a blue tie, hair plastered to his scalp, face locked on whatever imagined horizon awaited at 3 in the morning. Outside, the rain had gone from horizontal to just an indifferent drizzle. Martin watched the window, waiting for the arrival of dawn, or, better, a wave of mercy that would flush the parking lot clean and give them a shot at the next ride. But the world held its breath, clinging to the dark. Stefan cradled the mug between both hands, as if cold radiated out from him and needed to be contained. Neither tried to fill the silence. Martin finished his food, then, on impulse, peeled back the corner of his burger wrapper and offered the last misformed wedge to Stefan. Stefan looked at it, then Martin, and for a second Martin thought he'd refuse. But Stefan ate it, 2 bites, nothing left on the paper except a squelch of cheese and dyed mustard. Good. Something working as planned. Martin slouched deeper in the seat, legs sprawled like a half-deflated lawn ornament, and stared into the void of the window glass. His own reflection looked skeletal, eyes ringed with purpling fatigue. Martin felt the weight of it, the accretion of every bad sleep and gas station calorie pressing him flat. Even the coffee worked only as a bandage over the deeper, meaner tired running through his bones. He looked down at his notebook, now stippled with greasy fingerprints, and tried to focus on the logistics. If they went south on the N31, there would be a strip of truck stops every 30 kilometers. Hitching from one to the next would be easy during the day if they could convince a driver to take two scrawny Danes who looked like they'd escaped a midnight shelter for the chronically unlucky. Maybe if they could shave or lie better. Or maybe it was just a numbers game. Keep rolling the dice until the universe ran out of patience. Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow. Martin wiped his hands on a napkin, then fingered the coins in his pocket, counting them twice. Not even enough for a second cup of the world's least forgiving coffee. Didn't matter. The good rides didn't wait for you to be comfortable or ready. He slumped back, forced his pulse to steady itself, and scanned the faces in the cafeteria for anyone with the right balance of boredom and mischief. Stefan still hadn't moved. He'd gone small, like a hedgehog, jaw all the way in his collar, hands locked around the coffee. Martin wanted to say something impossible like, "Everything's fine," or "Your mom's not going to hate me forever." But the knot in his own throat just got tighter. He picked at a loose thread on the raincoat, watched the line of trucks outside the window, each illuminated in fits by the lights of passing cars. Through the glass, the gas station's neon sign spat light across the lot, blue and white and migraine bold. Martin stared at it until his retinas blipped. The drizzle smeared everything. Trucks, cars, even people, all losing their edge, softening into one another like colors melting in a watercolor tray. Martin thought it was fitting. By this hour, he wasn't even sure of his own outline. He pressed his thumb hard into the tabletop, just to make an indent, some proof that matter still held together. Now or never. He stood, shouldered his bag, felt like it weighed more than his whole body now, and jerked his head at Stefan. "Let's see if it stopped raining enough to find a ride." Stefan nodded but didn't get up right away. Martin waited, chewing the inside of his cheek. The effort of even this, waiting, not moving, acting like he had all the time in the world, was nearly enough to knock him out cold. He blinked, and when his eyes opened again, Stefan was already on his feet, mug empty, face scrubbed of even the ghost of emotion. The rain had mostly given up, just enough left to beat on the blacktop and run in micro rivulets along the curb. Martin zipped his jacket, cinched the hood, and stepped outside. The air carried a different note now. Ozone and exhaust and something sweet, almost bakery, though it was impossible to tell if it wafted in from a real kitchen or was just a phantom from his own skull. Silence wrapped the parking lot. Even the trucks idled softer, content to hibernate until dawn. On the edge of the covered plaza, a cluster of drivers huddled under the overhang, smoking with the aggrieved patience of men who'd been denied sleep and joy. Martin tried to pick out a candidate, but they blurred together. All stubble and polyester and knotted hands. He glanced at Stefan, who nodded, chin barely visible under the hood. The closest man, big, Eastern European, beard like a steel scrubbing pad, locked eyes with Martin for a millisecond, then looked away, uninterested. Martin attempted a smile, soft wave, but got nothing but a wall of Balkan indifference. At the edge of the group, a woman stood apart, cigarette in one hand, phone in the other, scarf wrapped up to her cheekbones. Her uniform was blue, workmanlike, probably a fuel desk employee off shift. She looked at Martin, openly amused, then back to her phone. Tiny data points, not a narrative yet. Stefan whispered, "Try the single guys. The loners." Martin nodded. He made a circuit of the lot, careful to stay in the open, no sudden moves. Try not to look like a car thief or a panhandler. Most of the cabs were dark, silhouettes slumped in the sleepers. He counted 6 drivers, 5 either out cold or pretending. One older guy was alive, reading the back of a noodle cup in the yellowish dome light. Martin hesitated, did the approach, low-key, hands visible, and lifted a "Salut, monsieur? Parlez-vous anglais?" The man looked up, scanned Martin's face for threats or sales pitches, then grunted, "Little," and set the noodles on the dash. Martin fumbled through a patchwork of French and English, pointing at his own chest, Stefan, then at the city, or what he hoped was the general direction of Paris. The man scratched his cheek. "I go Orleans, but Paris on the way. You have bags?" His voice was slow, thick, almost a parody of trucker worn. Martin nodded, waved Stefan over. The man opened the door, and Martin clambered up and over, limbs not responding on the first try. The cab was close, thick with the memory of cigarettes and heavy on the chemical tang of hand sanitizer. Stefan followed, contorting into the narrow middle seat, knees jammed up, both of them pressed close enough to feel the heat radiate from the man behind the wheel. The driver's name was Michel, or something that sounded like Michel, though he never offered a surname. He wore a pilled brown pullover stretched tight over a thick chest, hands dyed with years of nicotine and steering wheel grime. He pointed at the two backpacks, then at a footwell behind the seats, which already bristled with plastic bags, an electric kettle, and, incongruously, a soccer ball. Martin stuffed their bags down, careful not to knock over the instant noodle cup which was now sloshing in its own chemical soup. Michel started the engine, merged into the slow rolling column of trucks at the far side of the lot, and immediately lit another cigarette. Martin tried not to inhale too deeply, but the air was saturated, every breath with years of chain smoking. The radio crackled to life, French news looping every 4 minutes, and Michel grunted at the static before stabbing the button to mute it. The truck trundled down a frontage road onto the main artery, headlights slicing up the wet. The wipers squealed in their tracks. Martin braced for the first acceleration, expecting the cab to shake apart, but it was weirdly smooth, like the whole machine was built for one task only and did it at 70 kilometers per hour, forever. Michel didn't talk. Didn't need to. 30 seconds out of the lot, he cranked the window 2 centimeters and flicked his spent cigarette through it with a tiny, perfect twitch. The wind brought in the smell of wheat rot and distant cows. Martin tried to fold himself into the seat, but every part of his body felt like the wrong shape for the world. He wondered what time they'd get in, if Paris would still be awake, if the driver would mind if he just fell asleep and drooled on the dash. He could feel wet in his socks, a low-grade fizz, made worse by how warm the footwell was. The thought of another hour, then another, then the two of them in some suburb at dawn, felt like a story only if you made it out the other side. Stefan had gone completely silent. Martin tried a sidelong look. Stefan's eyes didn't register the movement, instead fixed outside, watching the red and orange glow as the trucks poured out into the night. Martin wanted to ask if he was good, if maybe he'd lost interest in the whole enterprise, maybe snapped some internal string. But nothing about the way Stefan sat suggested new brokenness. Only the same flatlined, running-out-the-clock vibe Martin recognized from countless afternoons in math class. Michael drove fast. Not nervous or showy, just ruthless. Made every pass, every merge, like he'd done the math and with a slide rule and found the margin of error personally insulting. Martin half expected the guy to just keep going right past Paris, drop them at the Atlantic and say, "There, you wanted an adventure? Swim home." Outside, the night thickened and the towns were only fleeting. A few sodium-lit houses collected in a dip or along a roundabout, each one an accidental poem. Shutters closed, a single TV firing blue light into the dark, a mutt nosing garbage at the edge of a loading dock. The highway itself was a straight nerve of motion, all neon white lines and orange reflectors, with trucks keeping formation like an army of insomniacs. Martin let his head loll a couple times, then, cringing, reasserted an upright posture so as not to look like a child. His body had lost the ability to calibrate between exhaustion and mania, every muscle either sandbag-heavy or full of febrile twitch. Paranoid, Martin's brain short-circuited at first as the kilometers whipped past, the white markers flicking through the greasy windshield. The cab's air grew more saturated with heat and sour cigarette, the interior light painting everything the color of old teeth. He wondered what the hell time it was, looked at the dash clock, realized he'd misread the hour, not even 7 yet, more night than morning left. His muscles ached in places he didn't know could ache. He tried to focus on the monotony, let the rhythm of passing trucks compress his thoughts down to a single manageable pulse. Michel was a technician. He cut corners just so, never overcorrected, played the road with the mute confidence of someone who didn't fear sleep because he'd already killed it. Martin wondered how long the guy had been driving. How many days in a row? He imagined the man's entire life, a loop of truck stop road, truck stop nap. Years spent driving in and out of towns that, in a better world, would have allowed him to settle, have a family, maybe even see something beyond the soft blue glow of dashboard lights. Martin wanted to believe that Michel had more to his life than this. Or maybe this was more than enough. The precise geometry of the night, the rules that didn't change, the endless plastic steering wheel gripped tight enough to callus bone. After an hour, Stefan shifted in his seat, knees knocking the gear shift, then winced as if remembering he still had a body. He didn't try to speak. Martin rested his own head on the cold window glass and let the anxiety run its course. They were making progress. Every kilometer was one less to worry about. He counted down the possibility of getting stranded, of having to walk, of being found out and sent home in disgrace. The numbers fell away, replaced by the hard certainty of the route. They coasted into a new series of toll plazas, each slightly more illuminated, each drawing in a denser cloud of trucks and vans. The whole convoy quivered through in one organismic push, lights pulsing, horns popping in shorthand. At the last plaza, Michel uncapped a bottle of water and drank half of it in 3 gulps, eyes never leaving the road. The city signage began. Versailles, Suresnes, then finally Paris in the trademark blue rectangle, as if the place were just another off-brand highway exit. Martin felt it before he could see it. The change in air, the slow bleed of suburban housing into something older and more vertical. The sense that there was a boundary, even if it was just psychological. The rain thickened again, but now it fell in a finer mist so that every headlight painted tunnels through the haze. Michel said nothing, but his hands tensed on the wheel, his entire posture communicating in the universal language of the sleepwalker that this last stretch demanded something extra. The lanes were tighter, the traffic more erratic. There was less margin for doubt. Michel took the exit with a perfect banking glide, and they were in the underbelly of the ring road. Concrete, sleet, sodium lamps casting everything in a felonious yellow. The truck crawled through a canyonscape of high walls and razor wire, then emerged into a patchwork of overpasses and ramps. Martin caught glimpses of old stone and glass, placed like satellites above the infrastructure. He could sense the city even in the dead of night. How its gravity bent every movement, drew everything toward a single point. Michel downshifted, then coasted along a frontage road that twisted up to a freight terminal on the city's northwest side. He said, "I stop here. Easy metro there," and jabbed a finger out at the glass, at a clutch of neon-lit buildings. "Walk straight. 5 minutes. Then you go Paris." His face was deadpan, but there was an undercurrent of tired pride, as if he were passing a final exam on behalf of them all. Martin swiveled his head, absorbing the entire transition in broken snapshots. The terminal district was a disaster. Scaffolding, chain link, a cluster of porta-potties that looked abandoned by a retreating army. A rebar-studded stairwell led up to a sidewalk bright with LED signage. Not a single human was in sight, but the glow off the wet concrete was so strong it made Martin's pupils stitch tight. Michel guided the truck into a designated lay-by behind a row of idle semis, then cranked the engine off. The windshield fogged instantly at the edges. He gestured at their packs, then at the door, his way of saying, "This is as far as I go." Martin gave a real merci, and after a second's hesitation let himself look up, just for half a second, at the man's profile. Watchful, not unkind, but already somewhere else. Martin scooped his backpack from the cramp of footwell, then shoulder-shoved the door. The Paris air outside was a wall, denser, older, full of something almost animal. In the lamplight, everything glistened like the skin of a dead fish. On the sidewalk, the world narrowed to the edge of an industrial estate, the ground quilted with trash and rain. Stefan's sneakers splashed through a shallow moat, instantly soiled. Not that it mattered. They crossed the loading lot and veered toward the overpass, moving quick, as if the city might change its mind and revoke their landing. Martin zipped his jacket and lifted his chin, tried to inhale the fact of it, make the reality stick. He glanced over. Stefan was a shadow, face half drowned in the blue from his phone, cold, cheekbones gone sharp from the wind. Neither one spoke. There was nothing to say. Not yet. The city waited, all its heaviness and hunger, just 5 minutes further on. It was the last grind up the ramp that killed Martin's legs. His muscles twitched, knees made of water, but the stadium-bright glow of the metro sign at the top, white letters chunked out of acrylic, wet with beads of condensation, drew him automatically. Stefan reached it first, hands dug so deep in his pockets it looked like he was trying to detach from his own body. Inside, a single automatic door hissed them into a blast of heated, recycled air and the chemically sweet reek of wet tile. Everything about the foyer was too much. Floors polished to a bleeding shine, vending machines humming like stung nerves, a panel of ticketing screens pulsing with blue-on-black code. Martin's mouth tasted like old fries and metallic sleep. He wiped his face with the inside of his sleeve, tried to blink the fuzz out of his eyeballs. The metro map sprawled across the wall, a color-coded tangle. Familiar from high school French, but now a threat. A game board with no clear starting square. Stefan hovered by the ticket machine, punching at the touchscreen with an intensity that suggested he might set it on fire. They'd spent so many hours on the road, Martin almost shuddered at the thought of going underground. But the world outside had all the comfort of a kill room, and the metro vestibule was at least anonymous. Martin let his backpack drop to the floor, slouched against the nearest column, and stared at the ceiling lights, each a perfect humming circle. His body vibrated with fatigue, nerves janked up on caffeine and anticipation. The station was empty, but for a janitor in a high-vis vest mopping a 30-meter stretch of nothing, Martin envied the guy. A job, a place to be, a fluorescent square with rules and expectations, and zero risk of being mistaken for someone interesting. Stefan caught Martin's shoulder. "Which line do we need?" Martin unpeeled his cheek from the column and blinked at the map. Colors meant nothing. Each transfer station was a blur of vowels and double consonants. "Line 1, I think. Or, wait, Montparnasse is blue, right?" He tried to sound like he remembered, like he'd studied this. "It's just a couple stops, dead easy." Stefan mashed the screen with his finger, picked the first ticket type that appeared, and willed the machine to print with a silent, vibrating patience. It did, 3 seconds later, and he snatched the rectangles before they hit the collector tray. He pressed one into Martin's hand, a hot, crisp rectangle, not quite paper, not quite plastic, the words on it some cutting parody of Danish order. Martin thumbed the edge, felt the crispness, imagined it as the ticket for the next universe. The two of them moved like sleepwalkers to the turnstile, cycling through the motions. The city above was legendary, but in here, under Paris, everything was blank, a womb of concrete and sound. He hated how bright it was. Every wall bounced back his own outline. Sallow, chewed up, not even close to mysterious. Martin checked his reflection in the plastic window of the subway car as it arrived. He looked like a cartoon of a runaway, one of those kids in old movies who goes missing and shows up in the news, the photo always 2 years and a haircut behind. No one would believe he'd made it himself, or that it mattered. Except maybe Stefan. Maybe that feeling next to him was the only thing still working. The doors hissed open. Stefan picked a spot by the hinge, as far from the only other passenger, the old man in the car, as possible. Martin had expected Parisian subways to be crammed. Romantic, maybe. Crowds of beautiful people doing beautiful things. But at midnight on a Friday, the car reeked of piss and bleach and was empty all the way down except for a single snoozing derelict in the corner, wheezing through a rolled newspaper pillow. A thin, electric hum ran under everything. The doors coughed shut. The train lurched, and for a second, Martin nearly fell backwards into an ad for an internet phone plan. He tried to make sense of the route. Val de Fontenay, Bastille, Gare de Lyon. 1, 2, 3. We get off at Gare, he murmured, just loud enough for Stefan. The bench was cold even through 2 layers. Martin stretched his legs into the aisle. The weightlessness of motion, the sudden lack of decision-making made his thoughts come loose. He watched the darkness slither past the window. His head wanted to dream, but his stomach was in charge now, a tight, twisting band that didn't know what rest was. 3 stops. Martin looked at Stefan sideways. Stefan's face reflected in the scratchy plexiglass, blurred into the sleepless Parisian dark. It wasn't the face of someone ready for gratitude or panic, just a teenage face, jaw set, mouth slack, a version you could see in any city, any train, any time of day. Martin wondered if anyone on this train would guess Danes, or, if they were really psychic, guess the real backstory. 2 idiot boys smuggling themselves past boredom and parents and fear, trying to outrun the memory of how fast everything at home could break. Paris at dawn looked nothing like the movies. It was just hard, impersonal light, and a city that had gotten a jump on hangover. Martin hoisted his pack onto an unfamiliar street and felt, for the first time in forever, awake enough to regret it. Last night's coffee was a war crime in his stomach. His skin itched with a salt of old sweat and road filth, and his mind, which should have been howlingly alive at the finish line, was instead a damp sock at the bottom of a gym bag. He tasted blood. No, Haribo and blood, in his mouth, and wondered what kind of person he'd be once he found the river, or even just the next bench. Stefan's face was a chunk of sidewalk shadow. No sleep, no hope, all jaw, hovering 2 meters down the incline, his hood so tight it made his skull look elongated. Champs-Élysées is that way, Stefan said, eyes locked on some unseen landmark. You still want to get breakfast or collapse now? Martin nearly laughed, but his throat rebelled, so it came out as a grunt. We said outdoor cafe, river view, and actual croissants. Not dying until then. Promise. Okay, but... Stefan paused, scanned the block as if expecting a riot or a film crew. We're not exactly local material. You look like you fell out of a train. Martin looked down. His hoodie had absorbed enough weather systems to qualify as a river delta. His pants were streaked in abattoir gray, his shoes given up for dead, and now a kind of sponge for French gutter water. Still, the idea of collapsing into a clean booth, inhaling espresso, and watching Parisians judge tourists for sport, this still had traction. They started down the avenue. From the first block, Martin clocked the difference. Nothing here was ever quiet, even when it was technically deserted. Trucks idled in the curb lanes. A dog barked from behind shuttered bakery glass, but every other sound had a way of ricocheting off the stone. The shop fronts wore metal eyelashes of graffiti and roll-down gates so thoroughly tagged even the warning signs for police presence got defaced. Martin imagined himself being mugged by a child in a Peppa Pig raincoat and decided he could live with it. Parisians probably considered it part of the experience. He blinked sunlight out of his left eye, barely registering the ache in his ankle as he curb-hopped a tourist barricade. His backpack caught on the edge, nearly unbalancing him. For one hot second, he pictured staggering into traffic, getting his head caved in by a baguette truck and becoming a cautionary tale in a Danish headline. The absurdity jolted some fresh energy up his spine. Maybe he'd get his own Wikipedia stub. Stefan eyed a food delivery scooter as it zipped the wrong way up the lane, then said, "We could get Eggs Benedict anywhere. You realize that, right? But not with ambiance." Martin swept one hand in an arc, almost knocking over a trash can. "That's why you travel. Miserable in new locations?" He tried to smile, but his face had a layer of glue. Stefan's phone was out, already smudged and cracked, navigating with hysterical precision. "The only places open right now are boulangeries and those," he said, indicating a neon-lit kebab shop that looked ready to be raided by the health ministry. "You want ambiance? Get used to baguette at the bus stop." "Look," Martin said. "There." A block away, an open awning creamed the sidewalk with yellow light. He quickened his pace. His heels seized up, but pain was a better stimulant than caffeine. Each step forward, his body loosened, the backpack redistributing its mass. Stefan jogged to keep up, footsteps splashing the sidewalk in a syncopated rhythm. At the corner, two street cleaners in reflective vests eyed them with flat disinterest, one cracking a Raleigh and the other just letting the broom rest against his hip. Paris. Nobody asked questions until you became an inconvenience. The cafe looked like it belonged to a different time zone, maybe a different decade. Pale wood, brass handles, a glass counter filled with pastries so perfect they might have been vacuum sealed. The chalkboard menu still bore yesterday's prices, and a lone woman behind the bar was already pouring coffee for the only other customer. A bald man in a paint-flecked three-piece suit, reading L'Equipe through bifocals. Martin caught his own reflection in the glass. Hair up in a wheat-blonde matador swirl, cheeks raw with windburn, eyes bloodshot and hungry. He'd seen better corpses in morgue photos. He stepped inside anyway, pushing through the unfamiliarity like it was a crowd. The woman behind the bar clocked them instantly. No stutter, no curiosity, just a professional nod that said she'd seen worse and served them anyway. "Deux cafés?" she asked, almost rhetorical. Martin said yes, so fast his tongue tripped. "Oui, s'il vous plaît." "And two of those?" He pointed at what looked like almond croissants, their sugar glistening in the reflection of the lights. Stefan deflated into the first available chair, hands spidered flat on the little marble table. Martin tried to sit without whimpering, but his thigh seized mid-bend. He covered it by clattering his backpack to the floor and grinning at the paint-suit man, who, true to Paris, did not acknowledge their existence. The cafe's air was saturated. Espresso, almond, cleaning solution, a note of old cigarettes, and something Martin sniffed, maybe overripe banana. There was always a banana. He wanted to bury his face in the croissant, just press it against his sinuses and inhale, but the woman had already placed the coffees and pastries, effortless, almost ghostly. Martin forced a merci through his teeth, amazed that all his language skills hadn't shorted out en route. He sipped the coffee. It was a literal, actual liquid, not the weaponized tar he'd grown used to in transit. There was even a molecule of sweetness. He grinned into his cup, the muscles at his jawline waking up in increments. Stefan downed half his coffee in one go, then just stared at the croissant with a look that bordered awe. Martin realized with private glee that this was not a bit. Stefan was genuinely amazed by the thing. Martin bit into his own, and the crust sang. The interior was a net of butter and air, a million honeycomb holes, a flavor so good it made the nerves behind his teeth shiver. He barely chewed, just mashed, swallowed, and went back for more. The barista had already retreated to the espresso machine, indifferent. The paint-suit man turned the page of his paper, meticulous, as if every movement required 3 prior approvals. Stefan didn't speak for a full minute, which itself was a kind of miracle. The coffee and sugar tugged his face open, just a little, until he looked almost like the version he'd had in Denmark, maybe even awake. Martin wanted to say something, big, philosophical, a summing up of the whole trip, but there was only so much honesty a breakfast could take. He settled for, "Worth the 50 hours of wet socks?" Stefan's jaw flexed. He moved the croissant from plate to mouth like it was radioactive. The sound he made was neither negative nor positive. A half-swallowed, "It's not bad," which as far as Stefan went was a standing ovation. He chased it with another sip, this time letting it burn. "I think I have a cavity." "I think I have 70, Martin said. "But now we get to die happy." Outside, Paris churned. The yellow of the awning had given over to full morning gray, and with it, the beginnings of foot traffic. Women in tights, men with scarves that cost more than rent, a jogger who looked like she was training for a magazine cover shoot. For an hour, when most of the world was still thinking about sleep, the tempo here buzzed on. Stefan watched it through the glass, not moving, not dreaming up ways to escape, just being, which for once seemed like enough. Martin finished the last micron of croissant and pressed the sugar packet flat, then flattened it again, then realized he was cycling through a nervous tick of his dad's worrying at the table. He made his hand stop, forcibly. "What do you think Jensen is doing now?" Martin asked, then regretted it, like conjuring a distant uncle you never wanted to see again. Stefan shrugged, eyes on the window. "Still driving. He'll hit the Spanish border and keep going. Some people don't know how to stop." It sounded rehearsed. Martin wondered if Stefan was talking about Jensen at all. "Me either," Martin said, and surprised himself by meaning it. He finished the coffee, burning his tongue on the last gulp, and realized it wasn't the road or the adventure he'd miss. It was the context, the story of this moment, how it could only happen here, now. Two foreign bodies, vibrating with exhaustion, and still alive in a cafe that didn't even pretend to care what they'd done to get here. He remembered when he was 12 and his dad had made him memorize the metro lines of the London Underground for a family trip. "Pointless," Dad had said. But also, what if you lost your ticket, or got on the wrong line, or the world really did end, and you had to get yourself across an entire foreign city? It was the first time Martin had truly hated him. Just a little, not enough to last. But it came back now. The echo of those colored lines, the rote comfort of a system that didn't care if you were tired or stupid or scared. Martin wondered if that was the point. Something steady to grab onto when you didn't know who you'd be in the morning. He let the thought drift as the paint suit man stood, folded his paper with surgical crispness, and left a coin on the saucer, never looking at Martin or Stefan. Maybe that was the only real Parisian test. Whether you could share a space, a moment, and never once need to acknowledge another's presence. Martin respected it in its own way. When the woman behind the counter called out, "Bonjour, monsieur," it wasn't theatrical, just the finality of a shift, the way daylight put a period at the end of every long, stupid sentence. The urge to stall was stronger than any desire to get moving. Martin dragged out the last sips of coffee, pulling flavor from the bitter scrape at the bottom, then shellacked the cup with 2 sugars, just to see if he could bully it into feeling like the first taste again. He watched Stefan, who did nothing at all, just nested his chin on one fist and observed the world through 2 centimeters of glass and centuries of expectation. Movement outside intensified. The city was up and walking off its hangover, horns beginning to blurt and old men haggling with bakers in a conducted fugue. Martin fantasized about staying here all day, just rotating through every caffeine delivery system until they had to shovel him out at closing time. There would be 300 more breakfasts, or just one, and it was impossible to know which would be enough. Nobody in Denmark, or at home, or even in the weird hinterland of the internet, had ever explained what came after you proved you could do a thing like this. Stefan finished his croissant, the last shred of it pinched between thumb and forefinger, then reset the plate at a hard right angle, as if waiting for the server to grade his performance. He pressed his tongue against a molar, then flicked a glance at Martin. "You think they'd let us stay here until night?" Stefan asked. "Or do cafes have a time limit?" "Probably a law about it," Martin said, deadpan. He rolled the cup back and forth between palms slick with bakery sugar and wondered if he should brave the bathroom, or if his body would just rot in place if he tried moving again. The pain in his thigh had receded, replaced by a tight band in his right calf, as if something inside planned to unspool only when he stopped moving for good. He didn't care. This was what bones were for. He realized then that this was the finish line he'd wanted. Not a landmark or river or even the taste of proper pastry, but the feeling of being nowhere in particular and making it count. He stared past the glass at the city, a puzzle box he didn't have to solve, and let his brain go soup for a while. Stefan made a low sound, half laugh, half sigh, maybe the residue of sleep finally trickling out. "We should get a souvenir." He looked at Martin with an expression that might have been joking or might have been a dare. It was always impossible to know in advance. "Otherwise, nobody will believe it happened. We could steal the sugar bowl." Martin nudged it for emphasis, then flashed a grin. His own voice sounded different here. "Big score," Stefan said. He pinched one of the pastel sugar packets and secreted it into his jacket pocket with theatrical subtlety. Martin stifled a snort. "What are you going to do, line them up at home?" He pictured Stefan's bookshelf, already loaded with fossilized sodas and weird bits of lint kept from math camp. There would be, someday, a row of blushing blue and pink and yellow French sugars, a rainbow that misidentified itself as evidence. Stefan shrugged, then did the thing he did when he couldn't decide whether to escalate or let it drop. Composed his face into a question mark and waited. Martin recognized it, but for once didn't bite. He was too full, of food, but also of the animal pleasure of not having to be clever or quick. He wanted to just bask in it, the spent morning warmth, the way sunlight policed the grease off the window and made it into gold. Martin let his eyes rest on the slow, deliberate ballet of morning routines outside. People with somewhere to go. People who'd always had somewhere to go. He wasn't jealous, not exactly, but there was a pressure in the air now, a question. What next? His phone said 10:40 somehow, though the last time he'd checked it was 2 hours ago. It jolted him to realize he'd lost track of time, even for a minute. He checked his messages for the first time since Germany. There was the pale block of texts from his mom, each one a little more frantic, time-stamped at intervals that suggested she hadn't slept much. The most recent just said, "Are you safe?" in full caps, and for once, Martin didn't roll his eyes. He thumbed back, "Alive, arrived, will write after coffee," wondering if he'd ever be able to explain the gap between the person who'd left and the one now melting into this cafe chair.